Apologies have been received from Deputy Coppinger and Deputy Mick Barry is substituting, and apologies have been received from Deputy Fergus O'Dowd. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of their meeting, their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 1 on the agenda is the update on Rebuilding Ireland. I would like to welcome to today's meeting Minister Eoin Murphy and his officials, Mary Hurley, John McCarthy and Dave Walsh, and I believe the Minister of State, David English, will be joining us shortly. Before we begin, members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Minister Murphy for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank Chairperson and the members of the committee for the opportunity to appear again before you, and this time to give you an update on the progress made in terms of the implementation of Rebuilding Ireland. I'm joined this afternoon by John McCarthy, Secretary-General of the Department, and Assistant Secretaries Mary Hurley and David Walsh. And Minister of State David English will be joining shortly. Rebuilding Ireland is many things, but at its core, it's a delivery plan with a singular objective of delivering more for the citizens of this country. I've said many times that the housing challenges that Ireland faces cannot be solved overnight, but that is not to say that we are not dealing with the day-to-day priorities or ignoring the significant issues. We are endeavouring in everything that we do to provide ongoing support for our most vulnerable citizens in every way possible, while managing long-term programmes to create a sustainable pathway to a stable and consistent housing sector. Nowhere is this more evident than in homelessness. The first 6 months of this year have seen 2,332 adults exiting homelessness into an independent tenancy. 3,600 households to date have been assisted under Homeless HAP, and over 200 housing first tenancies have been established, but more needs to be done and more will be done. It's a complex issue with many contributing factors, and supply is one of those key factors. Increasing supply of appropriate and secure accommodation is the main objective, but so too is ensuring that while we await that supply coming on stream in a sufficient quantity, we have a robust system of response in place to meet the needs of citizens who, for whatever reason, find themselves presenting as homeless at our local authority housing desks and in Parkgate Street. This means continuing to provide shelter in the most appropriate accommodation available. We know that hotels are not that, and that is why I recently wrote to the Dublin local authorities requesting that they expand their hub programmes so that the short-term emergency accommodation that we provide is as suited to the needs of families and individuals as possible. The key remains supply and the accelerated delivery of social housing, and need for linkage between the strategic and operational is an essential component of a successful plan. And that is why housing summits have become a central part of how my department engages with the critical partners for delivery. And in July we hosted a third summit for local authority chief executives and held very meaningful discussions on both strategic and operational issues, bringing forward a number of key actions. In recognition of the improved housing body sector as a major stakeholder in not only social housing delivery, but also in terms of tenancy management and services to the homeless and other vulnerable members of our communities, I invited chief executives of a number of Tier 3 and Tier 2 approved housing bodies to attend a dedicated AHB summit on the 17th of September of this year. The theme was collaboration between AHBs and local authorities, as well as collaboration with the market and with the development sector. Working together is achieving tangible outcomes. At the end of the second quarter of 2018, Rebuilding Ireland has delivered over 57,000 housing solutions across all of our delivery streams. And by the end of this year, I expect that number to have grown to approximately 70,000, and we are on course to achieve that. We committed to supporting 137,000 households into appropriate accommodation under build, acquisition and leasing programmes, as well as HAP and RAS over the 6-year period. And by the end of year 3, we will have achieved more than 50% of our target. The need to continue to intensify and accelerate new build activity is to the fore of our strategic planning. In the early years of Rebuilding Ireland focused on harnessing existing capacity and more immediate solutions, while in parallel progressing local authority and AHB capacity to build more and establishing solid project pipelines. Those pipelines are now in place and growing, as evidenced in the Q2 construction status report, which has just been published. And since the end of 2016, the number of schemes and homes in the programme has doubled. Activity on site has also increased significantly, with 1,074 homes going on site in the second quarter of this year alone, which is a 239% increase on the number of homes that went on site in the same quarter of last year. But there is no room for complacency. We have committed to exponential growth, and we are striving to achieve this. As Minister, I've also been clear that we need to address issues of housing affordability, recognising the pressures that exist for low to middle income households, particularly in Dublin and certain other of our main urban centres. Back in 2011, all affordable housing schemes were stood down given the prevailing economic position in the country. As you know, given the collapse in house prices, there was an overhang of unsold affordable homes at the time. This time around, it's important that we only target affordable housing interventions in areas that require them based on a consistent approach to economic assessment. In terms of affordable purchase, I've commenced the relevant provisions of the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2009, the effect of which is to place the new scheme for affordable purchase on a statutory footing. From engagements with the local authorities in Dublin, the wider Greater Dublin area, as well as Cork and Galway cities, their initial estimates suggest that they have lands with the potential to deliver some 4,000 new affordable homes. My department is continuing to work with the key local authorities and the Housing Agency to identify sites which would see the level of ambition increase to at least 10,000 new affordable homes from local authority-owned land, and that analysis is progressing well. With regard to cost rental, I am determined for it to become a major part of our rental landscape in the future. It is clear that there is a gap between social housing and the rental market that needs to be filled, making a sustainable impact on housing affordability, national competitiveness and the attractiveness of our main urban centres as places to live and to work. The Housing Agency, Dún Laoghaire County Council and a number of approved housing bodies have signed the agreements on our first cost rental pilot at Enniskerry Road, and tenders issued last month. In parallel, Dublin City Council, my department and the National Development Finance Agency undertook detailed modelling and financial appraisal on a major site at St Michael's Estate in Inchicore, which DCC will now develop as a major cost rental project. In order to support local authorities to get their sites ready for affordable housing, I've decided to provide additional funding for enabling infrastructure via the Service Sites Fund. Given that housing-related infrastructure will now be able to avail of funding under the €2 billion Urban Regeneration and Development Fund, I'm redirecting the €50 million funding for Phase 2 of LIHAF to the Service Sites Fund, increasing the scale of the fund from the previously announced €25 million to €75 million. And when local authority co-funding is included, an overall minimum investment of €100 million will be provided to those sites that require infrastructural investment in order for them to be brought back into use as affordable housing. A total of €15 million euro exchequer funding has been allocated for 2018, to which the local authority minimum contribution of €5 million will be added. This should enable the provision of infrastructure for around 500 affordable homes initially, based on a maximum level of €40,000 infrastructure investment per home. And one of the most significant actions taken since I last presented to this committee was the formal launch of the Land Development Agency, the LDA. This will be a commercial, state-sponsored body acting within a clear government policy framework, including that all public land disposals must deliver at least 40% of any housing potential on such lands in the form of social and subsidised or affordable housing. The LDA will establish a national centre of expertise for state bodies and local authorities, using experienced staff with expertise in project management, finance, planning, development and procurement. For the first time, government will create a state body to deliver on the key principles of the Kenny Report of 1973 and the NESC's latest research targeting land management and housing delivery that is intended to underpin the delivery of 150,000 new homes over a 20-year period, or around 25% of all housing needs envisaged by Project Ireland to 2040. In terms of furthering our ambition to maximise utilisation of vacant housing stock, my department published the National Vacant Housing Reuse Strategy 2018 to 2021 in July. It builds on significant work already begun in 2016 and 2017 by various stakeholders, including the Housing Agency, local authorities and approved housing bodies, in order to meet our Pillar 5 goals. The strategy sets out a number of concrete actions, including the adoption of vacant homes action plans by all local authorities and the appointment of vacant homes officers, funded by my department, to coordinate local actions addressing vacancy. It also provides a clear, signposted source of information for owners of vacant homes, including the funding options that are available to assist in bringing vacant homes back into productive use. In relation to the rental sector, as previously stated, Government approved the drafting of a new bill to amend the Residential Tenancies Acts. The proposed changes will further empower the RTB by giving it the necessary powers and resources to protect both tenants and landlords in the residential rental sector, particularly with regard to enforcement. These changes will further strengthen the effectiveness of the rent setting and rent review laws by empowering the RTB to investigate any contraventions of the law around rent limits in rent pressure zones and to take enforcement action if necessary, including the imposition of sanctions on landlords in breach and initiate an investigation without the need for a complaint to be made. The progress of the RTA bill will influence the framework, as each proposal will require a lead-in time for the RTB to put systems and resources in place for effective delivery. My department is working closely with them to identify capacity and what functions will need to be developed to implement the legislation. The proposed new powers for the RTB are a crucial first step in expanding its overall role and function as part of a multi-annual change management programme to proactively enforce tenancy law and assume more the role of a regulator within the rental sector. My department is working with the Office of the Attorney General in drafting this legally complex bill, and I hope to bring it to government very shortly. Following the pre-legislative scrutiny process, the committee has issued a report highlighting a number of recommendations, including the introduction of tax incentives for small-scale landlords. My department is considering the report with a view to making any necessary amendments to the existing bill or for consideration for inclusion in a separate planning, housing and residential tenancies miscellaneous provisions bill, which my department is also working on. With regard to short-term lettings, I'm currently considering the report of the working group and the recommendations from the Oireachtas Committee's report on this issue. I intend to shortly announce the initial measures and actions that can maintain or return to use properties for long-term rental purposes in our cities and urban areas. This approach recognises that the introduction of a new regulatory system will take some time to be designed and come into effect. And finally, as the committee will be aware, I've circulated a range of documents over the course of this week. I'm more than happy to answer any questions in relation to those documents and indeed in relation to the continuing progress we are making under Rebuilding Ireland. And Chair, just to add 2 further points, if I may, to my opening statement. I've just come from a meeting in relation to the homeless figures for August, which we've been trying to make sure that they can be published in advance for the committee hearing today. And my apologies that I'm giving the numbers to you orally now, but those numbers will be published imminently. For the August figures, the number of presentations was 238. That number is down on July. 114 families were prevented from entering into emergency accommodation, but we only had 83 exits from emergency accommodation at that time. Much of the reason for this was because our focus and our resources were put around protecting people in existing emergency accommodation ahead of and throughout the papal visit. The total number of people in emergency accommodation in the state following this work is 9,527. People will note that this is down on the number that was there in July, and this is because in conjunction with the publishing of these numbers, I'll also be making available a summary of the recategorisation survey that was conducted over the past 4 months. That recategorisation survey identified 741 homes that were being classified as emergency accommodation when they are not. Those numbers have been removed from the total number of people in emergency accommodation, but they were removed at various points in time over the past 4 months. So I cannot be clear on how many have actually come out of the August number themselves. But we now have a clear number in terms of the total number of people in emergency accommodation in the state. As of August, it is 9,527. And furthermore, I've instructed the CSO, I've requested the CSO, and they have agreed, will now become involved in the preparation and the compilation of our homeless numbers to get better accuracy on this data, because we continue to struggle to get accurate data month in, month out. Thank you. Oh, and a further point, sorry, Chair. I have documentation as well for each member in relation to the number of builds that are happening in their local authority at the moment, both social housing build and private building. I thought it might be useful to give people an accurate picture of what's actually happening in the ground in their local authority as we talk about ramping up supply and what more needs to be done. And that's being distributed at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister. Jennifer?
Okay, well, and thank you, Minister. I suppose, look, you know, we have to welcome that the homeless numbers are down, but anybody homeless, a child, a parent, it's unacceptable, you know, so it's something that we all need to work on, and we need to make sure that we don't have anyone homeless, and I think it's frightening to think that people are still homeless. Can I ask you about the rents, Minister, and they're rocketing, and I know that we've had the battle before when I've asked you about the rent pressure zones, and you said you thought it would be illegal to put the rest of the local authorities that weren't in the rent pressure zone into the rent pressure zone, because some of the local authorities are and some are not. And I'm just asking you, can you look at that again? Because as I've said, and I believe you spoke about it last week, or it was on the radio, where there was a documentary where the rents are gone so high in every area. And just giving you my own here, the HAP for Carlow County Council is 548. But a house in Carlow County, a house to rent in Carlow is €1,000 a month. So you have a balance there. Now I know there's only 20% leeway, but that's unacceptable. But I think we need, Minister, is rent cap to do with each different county, whether it's Dublin or City. There should be a different strategy. I understand there, I see where Dublin gets nearly 1,200, and that's fine. But in areas, in rural areas that I think you're forgetting, and even just in your opening speech there, and I welcome it, everything was based in Dublin, Cork and all the different areas. But you need to look at the rural areas, and I'm asking you to look at a different strategy, because I don't think the rent pressure zones are working. Can I also ask you about, you were speaking about, I was on about the HAP and the RAS and the payments again. Can I ask you, what is your plan? We have the budget coming, and I think this is a very important time, but in 2 weeks we're going to have a budget. Can I ask you, what exactly are your full proposals in the upcoming budget to help the rural Ireland, and what exactly are you going to do, or what is your plan? I want to welcome this, but in the budget as well, what are you going to do for local authorities? If you take the likes of Carlow, my own local authority, are you going to give them extra funding this year under the scheme? Because everybody, like you're saying, there's money there, and I want to welcome that. But what I want to ask you is, are you going to give extra funding to local authorities that have been crying out towards housing and other projects? If you could answer me on that. There is no progress where a team from local authorities could go first. So what I want to say about this is, right, if this is just an example of, if you need to build local authority houses, and I want to welcome the fact that you have the fast track planning and whatever, and rapid build, but there's so much red tape now between the departments, local authorities, local authorities, the time scale is too long. And what ends up happening is you're talking about 2 or 3 years of a time scale. Is there any way that, I understand everything has to be transparent and everything has to be above board, but is there any way that you can look at, because we have such an emergency and housing crisis, is there any way that you could look at rushing on local authority houses that need to be built? If you could do something on that, I actually think that that's so important. Can I also just ask you about mortgages? And I have a massive concern about mortgages. I think going forward, Minister, mortgages is the way forward for people that do not qualify for a bank or building society. As we know, you have to bring a proposal, a refusal from each to the local authority. But you're not actually, I feel, supporting it enough. I think your time scale is wrong, and I brought this up with you about 6 months ago, where you said to me that there's only a 6 weeks, if you apply for a mortgage, that there's only a 6-week delay. That's not true. There's a 12-month delay, and I have been dealing with at least 12 mortgages since that. I can give you names of, and that's not a problem. And it's nearly 6 months, between 6 months and a year, before I'm getting any actual word back. Between it goes to the department, then it comes back, it has to go to the credit committee and local authorities, then it could have to go back to the department. That's unacceptable, because if you apply to a bank for a loan, you will know within 2 to 3 weeks exactly why you qualify for your loan, whether you don't. And I think that's the way forward. I really do. But the biggest issue I want to bring up today, and I just am so disappointed with you, Minister, on this. I'm so disappointed. You have said, and you have said yourself on several occasions, that you are aware that the housing crisis is, look, it's not much better, but there is a small improvement, and that has to be welcomed. I asked you about, take Carlow County Council, where we are one of the lowest cap to qualify to go on the housing list. We are one of the lowest cap in the country of 27,500 compared to Laois, compared to Kilkenny. We are failing the system because the people of Carlow do not qualify. I had one woman that was €50 out to qualify for the local authority housing list. I was devastated. She was devastated. There's no appeal, and you know that yourself. You have no appeal mechanism to say, can I put that in for an appeal? That's unacceptable. Now, you had given me a commitment, and Mary and your staff, that would be addressed in September, that the cap for Carlow County Council would be risen. Because, Minister, this is part of your housing crisis. This is part of your homelessness. And it's not being addressed. And it's areas like that that we're falling down on. I know, we all have to worry about people that are homeless. And, I could give you names of at least 20 people in my own area that are what they call, is it couch surfing or whatever, where they have nowhere to go because we can't get them on the housing list. There's no room at home for them, and these are the people that are falling through the nets. So what I'm asking you today is, you need to give me a commitment today that the cap for Carlow County Council will be sorted in the next few weeks, and I'm asking you that, Minister, and I won't go today till I get a commitment from you. And the other thing I want to ask you about is
just bear in mind your 6 minutes. So
all right, okay. Look, Minister, I know you will come back again. I have loads of questions, but the cap, the mortgages, and working, and our government funding, I'm asking you from my point of view, for your, as we call it, central government funding going into the local authorities and our budgets. I'm asking you now, is Carlow County Council going to receive any extra help in the budget for next year? Because the budget plays a massive part in our local authority. And look, I'll come back to you again. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Senator. And you've raised a number of topics there, because you're so well across this issue, and I appreciate the time that you give to it. I'm going to work backwards, actually, to your questions, if I may. And thank you for recognising the improvements where there are improvements. But I think it's important that we do. A number of documents have been published this week, both ahead of the Joint Oireachtas Committee scheduled meeting that we had, but also it's the end of Q3, and so we're looking back to Q2, and it's kind of the traditional time to publish them. I had hoped that the work on the social housing eligibility criteria would have been completed in September. That was always the intention. I'm not doing it myself. The Housing Agency is leading on that. We are almost at a point of completion. There's going to be a lot of work in October in terms of further things being published because they've gone a little bit over time, and that is one of those things that we will do. I can't give any commitments on it until it's actually completed by the Housing Agency and it's given to me, but everyone has heard the concerns that you have raised, I think, a number of times in this committee. In relation to mortgages and the Rebuilding Ireland home loan, over 1,000 have been approved by the Housing Agency, and they go back to the Credit Committee. And so we are turning them around in the Housing Agency very, very quickly, but there are delays in the local authorities' credit committees. There's also an inconsistency in how the credit committees are making decisions. So on foot of recommendations from colleagues in my own party earlier this month, I am doing an assessment at the moment of the Rebuilding Ireland home loan. That assessment will be completed in the coming couple of weeks. It's been done independent of my department, so we can get an independent view closer to that of the local authority to get a better understanding of what fixes can be made. I've done a number of round tables with the key players before, but we're still finding kinks in the system. This review will hopefully work them out. In relation to red tape and local authorities, you know, I have sat in local authority chambers where local authority members have told me that a project has been with my department for 4, 6, 8 months and we haven't gotten it back yet. And when I've asked my officials, we only got it in the week before. I'm tired of this buck passing between local authorities and my department back and forth. It's not necessary. That's why I published.
I think. Go on anyway.
You know, whenever there's a problem, there's always a bit of blame to go around, right? That's why I looked for full transparency at the beginning of this year with local authorities in terms of publishing their own targets for the year and making sure we could have that layer of accountability that we hadn't had previously, and we could work to those targets throughout the course of the year so that you as elected representatives could see what your local authority is meant to be doing and ask it, well, why aren't you doing more? And if they then said the department hasn't given approval, you could come to me and say, why hasn't this been approved? And I could come back and say, well, this is the issue with that particular design, or this is the problem that we have around the financing, or whatever it might be if there was actually a delay. And that's the purpose of that programme. And in fairness to a lot of colleagues, the number of requests I've gotten into my department through written correspondence asking about a particular site has increased, and from time to time that can actually help expedite things. So I would encourage people to look at the targets for their own local authority areas, look at the details I've given you today, and see where you can help if there are long jams in the system, because we can all play a role in this. 59 weeks is the 4-stage approval process that was agreed with the local authority managers. Where it works very well, and it's very close, if not similar, to what happens in the private sector when it comes to design, planning, procurement, and all these things that have to happen before you go on site. So we're not too far off where we should be, but we can work it better. And I am looking at aspects of it again. You know, the conversations are happening at the moment between myself and other ministers on this issue, because I have heard it from enough people now that I recognise that we can look at it again. If we rush, I mean, this is an important point to make here. If we rush the development of any housing scheme, we don't want to risk a problem in 10 years' time, where that housing scheme needs to be rebuilt or redeveloped, or where we've made a fundamental mistake in the planning or the design or the outline, and you know, where we put the playground doesn't allow for passive supervision because we rushed to our design and then there's a worry about antisocial behaviour or something happening behind people's houses rather than in front of them. All of these different things that you'll encounter as you visit housing schemes up and down the country, and the different ways they're designed for very good reasons, and we want to take care when we do that. The budget, I can't tell you what my full proposals are. There's been enough conversation in the media to get a kind of an idea of what we'd like to achieve. We have moved away in this department from the big bang budget day, pretty much, where it's a big surprise, a big reveal on the day by Minister Donoghue. We have a multi-annual budgetary framework for Rebuilding Ireland, whereby we already kind of know what funding is programmed in and for which programmes pretty much next year and the year after, because it's a 5 to 6 year plan. And also in Project Ireland 2040, we've taken that view as well in terms of long-term planning. So you know there's a £4 billion urban regeneration fund. You'll know that it closes tomorrow. We'll be announcing people in October to draw down 100 million of funding next year. So we don't need to wait for the budget to be told that. That said, it's a couple of things that we will be doing in the budget, and how we'll be spending money, and some new initiatives, and those negotiations are ongoing at the moment. And anything that I can say publicly before the budget, I will. But you know, certain things have to remain until the last minute, because some decisions are only made in the last minute. We can get a proper idea of where the resources are going to be allocated as per priority, not just within my own department, but between other departments in government.
Minister, I'm going to have to come back.
Okay.
Because 12 minutes.
Sorry.
Senator Boyhan.
No, thank you, Minister, for that.
Well, first I'd like to welcome the Minister here, and I'd like to welcome the Secretary General and Dave and Mary. And first I want to acknowledge and want to congratulate David on his appointment as Chairman of An Bord Pleanála, and certainly we'll miss you. but I hope you won't forget everything we said to you here over the last 2 years. And I look forward to engaging with them both and all. And might I add before I start, because I'm only prompted myself by that, they have way slipped in terms of rebuilding Ireland. We still have no eye-planning system in this country, despite Simon Coveney, and I have a circular from him, that this would happen within 3 to 4 months. The great announcement of rebuilding Ireland, that we were going to embrace technology. And by the way, Minister, I'm not asking you to take notes of response, and that's not out of rudeness of my part, but I want to use my time as a sort of a monologue, for want of a better word, because I know we'll have many opportunities to talk, and you'll have many opportunities to come to both houses of the Oireachtas, so we can engage on that way. But I just want to say, in relation to An Bord Pleanála, we need to look at it, because we gave commitments about engaging in a process, particularly in relation to fast-track planning and student accommodation, a whole range of things, and we haven't fulfilled our contract. We have not fulfilled our commitment to the citizens. And I want to live in Dublin, but I wouldn't want to be living down in West Cork and trying to engage with An Bord Pleanála, or go in and look at bad etchings and bad drawings in planning authorities before I prepared some submission to the board. But anyway, I wish you well in that job. Minister, I want to say a few things. Firstly, I want to acknowledge your very strong and robust account of yourself in the Dáil during the week. I think it was impressive. I certainly took the time to look at it and listen to it. And so you're very capable of defending yourself. And you did it in a very professional and robust way. And I have no doubt about your personal commitment to housing and addressing homelessness. And I just want to acknowledge that. I like to be positive. It struck me when I was coming in here today, I'm not a member of your party. I'm not a member of any political party. I'm independent. That doesn't mean I'm against government or against government policy. That doesn't mean I'm against anybody. I'm against something when I think it's wrong, and I advocate and support something that I believe is right. That's how I am motivating myself in my own personal life and in my political life and in my business life. And I just wanted to make that point. But I want to acknowledge you did give a very good and strong account of yourself, and you demonstrated your absolute knowledge of this brief, and that has to be respected. So I just want to say a few things. It's like this. We have 10,000 people in accommodation. Despite all our best efforts, promises about hotels and emergency accommodation and hubs, and some of our hubs aren't great and some are very good, and I've been to many of them. We have 3,600 children who are homeless. That's facts today. And today, I have the latest figures, because there's much bandied about figures in relation to the amount of people, households on social housing. Today, the nearest figure we can be precise about is approximately 85,000 householders. And I've spoken to a number of agencies today, non-government organisations, and I want to acknowledge them, by the way. And let's not get caught up in the semantics of the numbers, because really, we're talking about people, we're talking about homes, we're talking about people's lives. But I want to use this opportunity also, all of us, to acknowledge the great work of Focus Ireland and a lot of the non-GO organisations, and the really positive things that are happening. There are really positive things happening in terms of people that have lifted off the streets, who have been given support, holistic support, housing and other forms of support, which is really important. And I think the day is over for the blame game of who's for and who's against and who didn't do wrong and the numbers. And I also want to make the point, and I welcome your CSO announcement here, that they're going to, because I said that to you last year. I said, we need, in this very room, I said, we need to have somebody that independently validates, and somebody took exception to that idea. They thought somehow I was having a pop at them. I'm not having a pop at anyone. We need to validate our housing figures, and we need to stand over them. So I just think that's important. We've 85,000 householders on our affordable official social housing waiting list. I do my own stats, by the way, with the Cross Authority 1 local authorities, with key councillors that I've built relationships with. And I want to make that point. I also want to acknowledge we had four councils here last night, and I was very impressed with them. And they had various views on it, but I think the point that came out of last night's meeting was they're sick of being blamed, and I'm sick of people blaming you and vice versa, so we need accountability. And I'd be saying in your next, if you're brave enough to have another one, of your great housing forums or meetings, that I think we should have the next one with us. And I wanted furthermore to say, I don't believe that you're tapping into the resources around this table. We have a wide experience in local government. Everyone here, I think, has been involved in local government. I'm reading about things like the Land Development Agency I received after the event. I speak to media journalists who are in this special category of housing, planning and local government, who regularly contact me to tell me they've been tipped off and briefed about things. That's the truth. Let's call a spade here. And we're the members not knowing. We had to request this after the event. I see people surrounding you with various gigs and openings in relation to policy. I ask myself why they're there. And I'm just not convinced that you are tapping in or your department is tapping in to the enormous skills and expertise and talent around this table. And that's a challenge, and I'd ask you to reflect on that and use us and have dialogue with us. And I don't want to be hounding anyone in your department, and I don't want anyone hounding me. But I believe we can be constructive and we can have a partnership together. Just 3 or 4 issues I want to touch on. Also to say, from stats I received today, 70,000 homes in mortgage arrears with 13 more than 5 years in arrears. So we have a crisis across the whole spectrum in terms of mortgages, in terms of rent, in terms of affordability, in terms of affordability to purchase and affordability to rent. And I just want to put a few things to you, and I know you might be able to fill me in some detail, but I'm aware, and I was in communication with you, and I believe it's sensitive. There's 150 acres sitting out in Thornton Hall. It is an absolute scandal. Now, either you do something with it or put it to use, or we consider alternatives. And I'm not sure if the government have considered moving an army barracks from Dublin out there, or some other facility out there. But I went to visit Thornton Hall, and I see the services on that site, and we could use it. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't really want you to engage on it, because there are sensitivities around these issues, and I like to be responsible. Shanganagh Castle, what's happening? I'm hearing the council are frustrated by your department. I'm hearing your department telling me that the council aren't providing the data. That's a big issue. That has the potential to create a lot of homes. I won't go on about Central Mental Hospital in Dundrum. You know the story there. But I would ask you to engage with the local authority here. Don't undermine local democracy. Support them, work with them, and get things done. I'm reliably told again from independent experts and people who validate this area that they tell me that there was 3,008 hectares of state-owned lands, which I've seen some maps of, which are across the country, which are ready to go. We need to know about them. We need to do a full inventory on the lands that are in state ownership, and we need to get them into housing. Or we need to get on to imaginative partnerships. I don't have a problem with partnerships. We just want homes up and built. I say we have a crisis. It's deeply dividing society. It's deeply dividing people. You know, we talk about that, regaining the city and reclaiming the city, and Garda have advised me that they believe there will be more of these events. People are angry. We've got to understand they're angry. We've got to empathise with them, and we've got to sympathise with them. But more importantly, we've got to stop the platitudes, and we've got to get on, and we've got to deliver something. So, Minister, I don't propose talking about your status report. It's good, and I acknowledge a lot of work has gone into it. I'm not too sure if it's the format going forward, because you've achieved a lot. You've actually achieved a lot of things. Stanislaus Kennedy said at a conference that I attended last week, you know, we're worse off in many ways in terms of the figures than we were when we started the Rebuilding Ireland. But look, I don't want to get into the figures. I just think we need solutions and we need to work together. And finally, I just want to ask you, or say to you, in a recent report from NAMA, an attachment to their 2017 accounts, they give a note on the social housing status to the end of March 2018. And I make this available. And they say 2,474 social housing units have been delivered, providing approximately 8,000 homes. But the more alarming bit is they tell us NAMA offered 6,984 residential properties for social housing purposes. Demand has been confirmed by the local authorities for a mere 2,717 of all of these properties. And there's more like complexities around that. Nothing is ever simple. But who owns NAMA? Remember who owns it. Who's responsible for it? And I know it's a separate vehicle and you can't interfere, and I know all the standard responses you'll get. But we have to ask, you know, the ordinary punter, the ordinary man and woman that worked, who pays their taxes, and those who don't work because they can't get a job, or whatever the reason, and I'm not making a judgment on either, but we owe it to the public, to the taxpayer, to this country, that we use the assets of NAMA to help us out in what is a housing crisis. So, Minister, I want to thank you for indulging on me and allowing me to have my little piece. It's not that I'm rude, that I don't want to hear what you have to say, because I'm not doubting your commitment. I know there are blockages. I know you too are frustrated. I know the officials are frustrated from time to time. I want to acknowledge their work. No question about the officials here. And we've all to be patient, and we're all in a hurry, and rightly and understandably we're in a hurry to resolve this crisis. So I have to leave, unfortunately, because I have to go to another important issue, which is the Oireachtas Audit Committee, which is a very long agenda and an interesting one today, and I'd like to play my role there too. So I say it's not out of rudeness that I'm walking out of here, but I think there are some points that you might reflect on, and maybe we can have ongoing dialogue in relation to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor.
Can I respond to Senator?
Yeah, he's 2 minutes left if you want.
If that's okay, Chair.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I might come back to Senator Murnane and O'Connor's other points if other people raise them. Just to thank you for acknowledging the hard work of the officials, Senator. It's very much appreciated, and congratulations you offer to Mr David Walsh. I couldn't think of a better person to be leading up on Murnane into the future, and I wish him well in that myself as well. I think you're right to note that people are angry. They are hurt as well, and they're right to be. But we've got to continue to make progress, and we've got to continue to look at what's working and continue that work, and look at what's not working and see how we can fix it. And so you put the challenge to me to have a housing summit with this Oireachtas. Let's do that. We will do that after the budget. We will make those announcements as part of the budget. That will be a further few initiatives in that, as well as what we're doing with our money. And then let's get together in that format. We might include some other stakeholders as well. And we will certainly do that, because every resource that we can put to this crisis, we should put to this crisis. And certainly whenever I attend a constituency, I invite any member who is there. Things like the Land Development Agency, unfortunately, we're leaking out of different parts of government, and we had to try and keep it as close as we could, because it's vested interest in all of these things. There are certain departments and agencies who don't want to give up their land for housing. But we're going to take it and we're going to use it for housing, because we have to. And by the 23rd of October, other departments will have had to come back to Cabinet with their proposals for land that will be made available to the agency initially. We already have that first tranche, Dundrum's part of that. We're in negotiations for further tranches. I have to say that the departments that we've been engaging with to date have been superb in terms of their willingness to come forward with land for new housing for the public, on public land, which I think is great. But that is a big piece of work that we have to do. You mentioned different sites. I won't go into that, Senator, because I know that the time is limited. And just on the NAMA offers, not all of them were suitable for local authority housing, unfortunately. But I had a PQ on this today in the Dáil that went into some of the numbers in relation to what the Housing Agency is trying to do with the 70 million acquisition fund, and that gives a breakdown of the bids that we have. There's roughly just under 1,000 at the moment in the system of the 1,600 that we hope to do by 2020. Thanks, Chair.
You might send that on to Porg, and we'll circulate that PQ then to the members.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Owen, thanks, Victor.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Minister. Just, I suppose, a small number of questions. Look, the homeless figures are up on the website, but the report on the reclassification isn't, so I'm not going to ask any questions about that, obviously, because I haven't read the report. What I would ask is that you give the committee a commitment that when we've had time to read and digest that report, that you'll come back to us just to deal with that issue specifically, because you know it's one that we're very concerned about. In relation to yesterday's Housing First strategy launch, first of all, I would welcome the Department and the Government's continued commitment to Housing First. It's the right approach, and it's one of the things we agree on. I also think it's a good thing we have a strategy and that you have somebody leading it. I have a genuine question about the targets. There's about 600 targeted new Housing First tenancies over 3.5 years. We know there's about 3,500 homeless single individuals. Now, Housing First isn't appropriate for all of those people. I accept that, and I've read and I understand the methodology that's used to identify the 600. It does seem to me, though, 600 over 3 years is a very low target. Clearly, those 600 individuals you've identified are the ones with the greatest level of need in emergency accommodation the longest, and therefore should absolutely be prioritised. I would just ask you, I suppose, to say, does the department have a figure for how many more Housing First will be needed from the knowledge we have of the people currently in emergency as singles? And can you give us an indication of why the targets are as modest as they are? Because I think, notwithstanding the fact that it's good to have them, they are nonetheless very modest. In terms of Pillar 2, so we got the report today, and I have two questions. One of the worrying things about the Q2 social housing output is that if you look at the local authority approved housing body bills in Part 5s, it's about 1,051 units delivered over 6 months. The target is 4,969 over the year. I don't think it's unreasonable to be concerned that you have a long way to go, and the local authorities have a long way to go to meet that target. So is there anything that you can say to reassure members that that target will be met? Because, you know, if you were 33% or 45% of the way, okay, that would be fine, but it's a long way to go. While you're ahead in the acquisitions target was always very low at 900, so I want to welcome the extra acquisitions, but it's still low. On the voids, Brendan Kenny was in here yesterday, and he told us categorically, and you weren't here at the meeting, so maybe yourself or the officials can go back and look at the transcript when it's up, but he said very clearly that they have no more long-term voids, that all they've got is expensive casual relets, and they don't categorise those as additions to the stock. Yet you have 387 voids in your figures, and there's 184 of those from Dublin City Council. So we're getting two different bits of information here. We're being told by Dublin City Council that they're not voids and shouldn't be counted as additions to the stock, and yet we're being told by you that they are and they should be. And I'm genuinely concerned because I think they're being wrongly categorised. I've also got a concern on the Part 5s. So if you take the Q2 Social Housing Construction Report and the Q2 Housing Supply Coordination Task Force, the figures on the Part 5s don't match the figures on the private builds, right? And again, maybe I'm reading the two reports wrong, but actually rather than what should be happening is the social housing Part 5s being at about 10% of the total private sector outputs, they're actually at 28% when you compare the two sets of figures for Q2. Maybe it's an accounting error, maybe it's unfair to ask you to give a detailed response to that, but if you can come back to that, I would appreciate it. Can we also get a quick update just on where we are with the approved housing body redesignation? Because there's a lot of concern in the approved housing body sector at that, and can you give us some indication of what the plan is and how it will roll out? We did deal with the RTB's Q2 rent index report today, and look, I know you're going to bring forward the legislation, and if the legislation does what you say it'll do, it'll certainly have our party support and we'll be happy to expedite it quickly. But it will only provide protection in the first instance for just over half the total number of tenancies. So for those people, for example, not covered by the RPZs, but you can see in today's report in Limerick, for example, or Waterford or Sligo Town, who are clearly getting unsustainable rent increases, what are you going to do for them and how are you going to respond to all of that? In terms of the Pillar 4 and the affordable end of things, I suppose the one concern I want to express is while, and again, you know, we've welcomed this Michael's Estate. I think it's a good initiative and a significant change in direction in terms of government policy on these developments up to now. I keep hearing yourself and other government figures mention a rent coming in at 10 to 15% of market rates, and that is worrying because it's not going to be genuinely affordable for the income cohort that were there. It's also not the same as what Dublin City Council are telling us, because they're looking at overlaying the cost of providing those units, both the financing and the maintenance, with the income of the tenants, and therefore you could be looking at a number of income bands, for example, to try and make sure you're not just getting the people at the top end of your affordable income cohort, but you're getting all of those. So I think actually in any way linking it to market rents is the wrong way to do it, and I just like clarity in relation to that. And then finally, in terms of the vacant home tax, can you confirm that the government on the back of the Indicon report are not considering a vacant home tax? And if you haven't made up your mind, can I urge you, particularly in the context of the very, very low uptake on the repair and leasing scheme, that despite the fact that there is a very good carrot, albeit underfunded in my view, but a good carrot, unless there is a stick of a vacant home tax to push not properties stuck in probate or fair deal, but properties that are being sat on speculatively by individual owners of funds, will you at least reconsider that issue of vacant home tax? Because I think without that, the likes of repair and lease will continue to dramatically underperform.
So, Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the questions. Just in relation to the recategorisation survey summary, I asked officials to drop it down, so if it might be dropped down shortly, and then I can pass it out because it's been published as well. I just asked for it to be printed as I left the meeting. In relation to Housing First and the targets,
Just on that, will you give us the commitment that you will come in and talk to us when we've had time to absorb that report, because it's important to us in committee?
Oh, I mean, I think so. I mean, again, to go back to Senator Boyhan's points, you know, we need to kind of move away from confusion around numbers to actually look at who we're trying to help and how we help them. And the recategorisation survey was a very important part of that work. And I didn't get to clarify it earlier in relation to the work that the CSO is going to do. It's not that we are taking it away from ourselves for the CSO to do. That was a very successful exercise when we did it with builds, because we can now have confidence around the build number and we can speak to accurate independent data. The CSO are going to help us in terms of our counting, analysis, categorisation, that kind of work. So the responsibility will still be kept with me and with this department as it should be. In relation to Housing First, so Sam Paris, whose surname I always mispronounce, is the leading expert internationally on this from Canada, and he was over for the launch yesterday morning. And one of the things that we need to be careful in doing in rolling out Housing First is absolutely, we know it works now, 85% retention rate, more than 200 homes secured. It's just to roll it out in the right way. Bob Jordan is absolutely the best person to be the national director, and he's put together a fantastic plan for the country. We have 200 already in place, we have 600 more coming, and in addition to that, there's around another 200 earmarked for people who may be coming out of prison and might have severe difficulties as they come out of prison in terms of establishing a tenancy or getting back into a normal life. So it's a larger figure actually than the 600. But the advice that I've been given is that we need to carefully roll this out slowly to make sure that we do it in the right way. And some of the difficulties that have been established in other countries is that some NGOs, for all the goodwill in the world, have said that they're doing housing first or housing-led initiatives, but haven't really changed their model or approach. And it actually hasn't had the desired impact in terms of that actual into a home and the services come to you type of approach to things. So I trust Bob Jordan's plan on this and his expertise in terms of the targets that we have. Initially, they are minimum targets. I was with Dublin Simon on Tuesday morning, I think, and they were talking about the new capacity they're bringing into the system and how they're going to make sure there's enough 1 beds and 2 beds for housing first. Bob Jordan also spoke at the Housing Body Housing Summit to tell them and reinforce the point that I was making: as you build, think about studios for housing first, think about 1 beds and 2 beds as well. So as we build more, we can expand those targets. We just want to make sure that we've got a programme that works so well and is designed to kind of best international practice, that we roll it out in the right way. On the construction side of things, yeah, you look at the build figure for local authorities and housing bodies and you see 1,000 in 6 months and you go, we've got to do 3,000 more in the second 6 months of the year. We have to get there. And we must get there. And last year we saw a step up in delivery over the course of the year that saw a kind of a slow Q1, a slow Q2, a jump Q3, and a lot of delivery in Q4. And it's really the way that the programme, our delivery programme, is designed, as well as funding being released. It does have that kind of ramp up quarter on quarter, particularly in the final quarter of the year. That's what happened last year. But I saw the numbers myself, and I have communicated to the local authorities, we have to get to these targets, and that's an absolute necessity. In relation to voids, I haven't seen Brendan Kenny's contribution to the committee last night. I beg your pardon, I was in other meetings. When we talk about voids, we're not talking about them being new builds, but the recommendation did come from the Oireachtas that they would be counted as part of the 50,000 that we would have in terms of the targets for the Joint Oireachtas Committee. We know that we've done a huge amount on voids over the past number of years. We know that that is a low-hanging fruit, is now almost coming to its end. We gave a significant amount of additional funding, I think, to Dublin City Council, to Brendan's own council earlier this year, to expedite its own void programme. So it might well be the case, and again, I haven't seen Brendan's remarks, that because that work has now happened, they don't feel there is much left in their own pipeline in terms of void delivery. In relation to Part 5s and the not matching, you know, unfortunately, there are still some sites that qualify under the previous law before it was changed, where they actually had a buyout option. But also, there's a phasing thing now where we're trying to expedite the delivery of Part 5s up front first, and we've been able to allow funding and release funding in that way. So that might explain the mismatch that you see in the two numbers. But as we kind of get in year-on-year cycles, those numbers then will certainly correlate. AHB reclassification. Work is ongoing. This has been led by the Department of Finance because we are treating it as an accounting issue and not as an issue that will get in the way of our build targets. And I reaffirmed that to the housing bodies at the recent Housing Summit. In relation to the Residential Tenancies Board and the new proposals that are proposed, if I could just reiterate the point, I suppose, and I know that everyone understands this, when this bill hits the floor, we've got to move on it quickly. You saw the delays that we had in the last term. It was so frustrating to see important pieces of legislation being delayed by filibustering and people with spurious contributions to make time and time again. We've got a real change that we can make for lots of people. We have to get that rent bill enacted before the end of the year. In terms of the qualifying criteria for rent pressure zones, this is something that the RTB has raised. If you look at Limerick, a massive increase in rent, but because Dublin continues to increase, they're never going to hit that average, that second qualifying criteria, and it comes back to Senator Murnane O'Connor's point earlier on about can we change these things. So I've heard that from the RTB, that the qualifying criteria as established in legislation isn't helping cities like Limerick that are seeing, I suppose, exponential rent increases. So I have heard them recognise that point. What I would say finally on that, though, is we have a second rent bill coming where we want to do some more complicated things. I know people will come with amendments for our first rent bill, but let's not bring amendments that might require further advice from the HE or further legal consultation that could actually potentially slow down the bill. Let's get the good things that we can get done, and then let's move to the second piece as we can. In relation to St Michael's, so I asked actually an official in my department earlier today, and I haven't seen it yet, for the presentation that was presented when we did St Michael's. And Deputy, you have that document. I don't know if in that document it had the financial modelling that we had done in terms of pay scales, and then what percentage it would be of their income, and then would there be actually an apartment delivered that they could meet? Because certainly as we worked this proposal and we looked at the number of homes that might be provided and then how they'd be subsidised and the level of finance, it was to ensure that affordable meant affordable, you know. So a piece of modelling was done. So perhaps Brendan was talking about that. So you have between 15 to 25% discount on the market price, which you need to try and achieve, balanced against what does that mean for a single earner or a couple and the qualifying criteria, and then this 35% of their income max going against their rental payments. So the NDFA did on that financial modelling. I've seen it myself and it stacks up. We'll have to remodel it once we have the final approval from the council, just to make sure, not once we have, as they do that final approval, the number of homes, the number of affordable homes will actually achieve that level based on those two criteria. That's what we're trying to achieve there.
Minister, I'll come back to you because we're gone over.
Okay, I'll come back on the vacant
We'll
home
have
tax.
time for another round, so it's
yeah.
not a problem. Darragh?
Minister, we've priority questions this morning, so I covered some elements of it. So I'm going to focus on some of the things that I didn't get to go through this morning. I was interested in your comment in relation to the local authorities and improving transparency. I think we'd all agree that, but I think what we also want is an end to the buck passing between your department and the local authorities and vice versa. I think, if we continue to blame each other, we're not going to get anywhere. And I have a major concern, which I share with Deputy O'Brien, is actually reaching the figure, firstly, in social housing of 4,000 by the end of the year. I think I hear what you're saying. You have a personal commitment saying this must be attained. Is your department, or will you look at raising the cap on local authorities? You have an average bill cost of about 210,000. They're your figures that I got from parliamentary questions. So basically anything over 2 million goes to your department to get approval. We've county architects drawing up very good schemes that have been sent into the department to be looked at by people who are their juniors and who are checking it and sending things back and forth. So if you've a local authority cap of 2 million, in, let's say, Fingal, in my area, you're probably going to, any scheme over of 8 or 9 houses and more is going to go into the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. It will be the same in the 4 Dublin local authorities, I would imagine. Cork, Galway, probably the same. And I really don't think that we're going to get the supply of social and public housing up unless we do something with that cap. I take your point, you don't want to rush. You mentioned that we don't want to rush things. Your department could never be accused of rushing things. What I would say to you is that, well, I'm just saying you couldn't be accused of it based on the output. But I really do think that this needs to be looked at. It needs to be tried. You could raise the cap if you don't want to go. If you went to 10 million on the cap, you could probably allow estates of up to 40, 45 houses be built and get on and let the local authorities do it. And if they're not doing it and you've given them the autonomy, well, then beat them up. Okay? And I think I genuinely mean that needs to be. We're not going to get anywhere near our targets if we continue with the same processes and procedures. So I would like to ask: has there been any consideration? Have you, as Minister, given consideration? Your officials may have a different view, but as you, as Minister, given consideration to actually looking at the criteria around what needs to be checked? And I would ask you very sincerely to please do so if you haven't. The affordable loans, I think it's interesting your point about credit committees, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Like 2/3 of applications have been refused under the Rebuilding Ireland affordable loans. I think it's about 100, as of June, about 134 loans had actually been drawn down. So it's a lot slower than any of us would want it to be. Okay, and I have people coming, applying to us, and it's seen as a good initiative. But when 2/3 of applications are refused, there's a problem, and a lot of it for technical reasons. Could I ask you, have you seen, could you confirm that there's actually common underwriting criteria across our local authorities and the underwriting of those mortgages? Because I don't believe there is. I've actually seen one local authority deal with overtime and bonuses differently than another, and it generally always seems to be at the expense of the applicant. So if the overtime or bonuses relate to put them over the limits to apply for the affordable loan scheme, they're out. And if it's on the reverse and it's not enough, they're not getting enough for the mortgage. So I think there is a job of work to be done there. There should be uniformity in mortgage underwriting, particularly around the basic criteria, salary criteria, what's taken as salary and what's taken. So that needs to be done, and I don't believe it's being done. Our target there, I think we're way off. I think some of it is to do with that, and I would agree with you on delays in committees. Could I ask, though, is it a question, and you will be able to answer this, or is it a fact that each of the affordable loan applications, whether they're applied in in South Dublin, in Galway or in Fingal actually go back to the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government for a check or a validation, not for a decision. And I'd like an answer on that. In relation to HAP, and this is something, our over-reliance on HAP, and there's a necessity there, and I'd agree with you, and we've discussed this ourselves. But if you look at 2017, 152 million was spent on housing assistance payments. 2018, 301 million. Have you a projection for next year? That's a doubling of it, okay? Look at the expenditure on housing assistance payments and versus the capital expenditure. And if the rates keep going as they are, within 4 years we'll be close to £1 billion a year. And it's something that we are creating a monster there out of necessity in many instances. But unless we get the supply up to be able to move people out of HAP and into public housing and into permanent housing, we've got a big problem, because it's going to keep eating into our capital budget unless we find new mechanisms. Those figures are absolutely astounding in that regard, and I'm just wondering maybe if you yourself have a view on that, as about how we can move that around and put more into capital than current, because the pressure on your department and on the Exchequer in relation to HAP payments is phenomenal. That's where I think the fundamental plank of Rebuilding Ireland about the number, about deeming someone's housing need as being met under HAP, is something I would fundamentally disagree with. I think in the main, unless it's a long-term lease and a secure lease, if it's 12 months, I think we've a problem there. So it shouldn't be. So that is again the issue of removing people from the main housing list when they get a HAP tenancy and putting them on a transfer list. I don't think we should be doing that. The Local Development Agency.
Do you want the Minister to answer these questions?
Yes. So how much?
6 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more and then I'm going to conclude. Right. Affordable housing we discussed this morning, so I'll leave it at that, and we question that in there. I would just say repair and lease. Really, we do need to look at it. 800 targeted, 15 delivered. Is that the local authorities or is it the criteria? Maybe it is. And the very final thing, the Land Development Agency. When do you propose to bring the legislation on that? How long do you think it would? I have many concerns on that and on the proposals, which we will debate when the legislation is published. When is that going to be? When do you think it will be established, and when do you think that agency will deliver its first home? So I'll leave it at that at the moment, Kerry. Go on.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the questions. I'll just run through them as quickly as I can in the time available. Yeah, like this book passing, so, you know, again, I've spoken to those points, but when I communicated with the local authorities recently, it was about emergency accommodation. It was about looking at the number of families in hotels and not seeing a corresponding programme to get them out of hotels into hubs. And that's what that intervention was about. People will know that I've been defending local authority builds for the last 14 months, and I'll defend them again today, because some of them are doing great work, some of them are not. We were 8% off our build target last year. So I had similar concerns last year in terms of how our build trajectory was going, and at the end of the year, we were only 8% off. We exceeded every other target that we had: acquisitions, leasing, voids, and everything else. So a huge amount of work was achieved, and I'll have to continue to drive the local authorities with my officials to the end of the year to make sure that we hit our targets for this year. In relation to raising the cap on the one-stage approval process, I'm already looking at it. In relation to things being too slow in the department, just to say that my officials work incredibly hard, but when we're building houses, they have to be safe, they have to be planned well. People have put short circuits to me, like every social housing scheme should be designed the same. If we have one design plan, we do it much quicker.
I wouldn't advocate that.
Exactly. But so if someone has an actual legitimate short circuit that might actually work without
raise the cap,
creating other problems, well, that's what I am looking at already. But
yeah,
just in relation to slowness, if you're talking about building 20 homes, you need to stand there in 70 years and still be safe, secure structures. Yeah. It's not something you can rush. The home loan. So 50% of valid applications have been approved by the housing authority, the housing agency.
Not a lot.
Over 1,000 loans have been approved. We're not. If they were all drawn down, and I'll come back to that point. Or sorry, they're all approved by the credit committees, we'd almost have exhausted the first tranche of 200 million. So it's a significant number of loans that have been approved by the housing agency. The problem with the credit committee, and that's why we're doing this assessment at the moment in terms of what's happening. Drawdown isn't perhaps a fair measure, because this was only opened in February, and anyone who's had to buy a home before, from the time that you actually get your mortgage approval, go looking at houses, get into all the sale agreed and everything else, by the time you actually draw it down, 6 months. You know, it can be 6 months. So
the common underwriting criteria.
On that, so The housing agency, they go to the housing agency, they go back to the credit committee, they don't come anywhere near the department.
So a housing agency, though, all of them go to the housing agency?
Yeah, but they're not underwriting them. They are looking at it, they're doing the due diligence on the financials, but the credit committee makes the decision. And we need to make sure that each credit committee is making a decision and applying things in the same way, in a consistent way, consistency across local authorities. It's not the only area in which they're inconsistent, right? But we can achieve it with the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan because it's a simple, straightforward product. I've already had those meetings myself, and now we have an independent assessment happening, working with the department, with people outside of the department, looking at it to see how we can achieve that consistency.
So are you going to, will there be a common underwriting criteria that you
I'm going to let them do their work, and then we're going to see what we need to do.
Okay, thanks.
In relation to HAP, 26,000 households were supported last year, a lot of them because of HAP, right? We have to have HAP at the moment. But by 2020, 2021, across those 2 years, we'll put more people into the stock of social housing than we will into HAP. So we will finally then start to turn that situation on its head. And you know the commitments in Project Ireland 2040 beyond Rebuilding Ireland are essentially for every 5 homes built every year, one... I'm sorry, what's
the last spent about 20...
Oh, sorry. So over 2020 and 2021, we'll house more people through the stock of social housing than we will through HAP. So we will start to rebalance back in favour of controlled social housing rather than private rented sector for housing supports. We'll still HAP after that because people like HAP, so it's been very successful for a lot of people, but we will kind of turn that balance on its head. And then for every new 5 homes built in the state from 2021 on, between 1 and 2 will be social housing homes out to 2027. I got that commitment into the Project Ireland 2040 National Development Plan. I think it's an important commitment. I can't give the 2019 budget figure for HAP. But if you want to come up with a figure and give it to the Minister for Finance, I'll support you.
Projection. If you take 45,000 tenancies, your department will have a projection. So of new tenancies based on what's happened up to now. You should have a projection.
Yeah, no, we do. But like, I'm not going to
come. Want to share it now,
I'm not going to come with a final figure on HAP because.
But it will be increased, obviously.
It will be increased. We're going to have more people next year.
Yeah.
So the current figure of 300 million is going to go up. It'll go up by.
Okay. I don't want to tie it
but
to
you know it's going up
yeah,
because we're going to support people through HAP next year because we have to. More existing tenancies and new tenancies as well. I think people should be very careful on this. If the state is paying for your rent, your housing need has been met. I think that's an important. I mean, that's what's happening with HAP, and people are very successful in HAP. When you look at the reports that I provide on HAP in terms of the number of exits out of HAP or the tenancies not working out and the different reasons, HAP has a flexibility. People are working. You know, people have good relationships with their landlords. HAP works for a lot of people. If you want to say that it's not meeting their social housing need when the taxpayer is putting in a great support there, I disagree. I really disagree on that.
I respectfully disagree because it's not sustainable.
That's a different point, though. Deputy, that's a different point, though. It's not sustainable to rely on HAP for our social housing supports the way we are at the moment. That's a different point to whether or not we're meeting the housing need, though. Okay. Repair and lease. There was a good programme on this the other night. I didn't see it, but I heard it was good. It went to some of the properties that I inspected myself. Repair and lease. So there's a conversation that we've been having around vacancy. The latest report on Indicon, I don't know if the committee's had a chance to debate it on itself, is incredibly interesting. The true level of vacancy in Dublin is 0.6%. Like, it is not the types of numbers that we were talking about in the CSO, because we knew when we talked about the CSO numbers that they included houses for sale, houses for rent, houses in, that are undergoing renovation, people in nursing homes. The repair and lease scheme is a fantastic thing, but its criteria are quite unique. You're talking about someone having a second home that they don't live in, that is in a state of disrepair, significant disrepair, that it can't be inhabited, that they don't have the funding to provide for, and they're not going to need for at least 5 years. Like, it's a good scheme, but the number of people that might potentially avail of it might not be as significant as we first envisaged. But I've been speaking to deputies outside of Dublin where there is vacancy in their own local authority areas, very close to urban centres, a very short commute from, to see if there's something that we can do there in terms of actually pairing people up, actually. So there's something else I'm looking at around repair and lease, because I think it's a good programme, but it's still not delivering in the way we thought it would. And there just might not be the demand that we had at first anticipated when we were looking at numbers originally 2 years ago. In relation to the Land Development Agency, the general scheme will be published later this year. The Land Development Agency is already working. It's been set up under a different act on an interim basis, so it can still work on those sites that have been identified. It can still negotiate with departments and get additional sites into the pipeline. I think we can get it established. I think I answered a PQ on this earlier in the Dáil this morning, and I think I said by Easter. of next year. And that's when we can then move into its second phase of funding, which is the capitalisation under ISIF. It's going to be capitalised initially under the Urban Regen Fund to about 20 million to allow it to do its work between now and then. It's going to be an exciting debate. Moving the legislation, people have different views on this. I think it's really important.
Thank you, Minister. We actually have we'll be inviting the Land Development Agency in late October, November.
Okay.
Minister, or Deputy Barry.
Minister, do you think the housing crisis has peaked?
Are we doing it back and forth?
Yeah, let's go back and forth.
No.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, ask me more questions.
When do you think it will peak?
I can't tell you that, Deputy. I can tell you that we're in the middle of a very serious crisis. I can tell you that it's linked fundamentally to a lack of houses being built. But I can also tell you that the building of new homes is ramping up very dramatically. But as I said in the Dáil earlier this week, presentations of families is going to continue. It continued in August. It was down on July, which is good, a small bit.
Okay, so let me ask you.
Well, I might just continue speaking if I may, because you kind of left it open in the question. And we're going to have to continue to be fully committed to finding solutions for those families, because they are presenting through no fault of their own, and it's linked to things that are happening in the private residential sector. Of course it is, and that's why they put in more strengths there. It's linked to things like short-term lets, which are taking away from the long-term letting market. Of course it is. And it's linked to things fundamentally like supply. So we'll need to continue to drive all of those things. Rebuilding Ireland was always a 5-year plan. But as I said in my opening statement, on the supply side, we're ahead of our targets. And actually, outside of what the government is doing, the private sector is ahead of what we thought would be delivered as well.
Okay. So if the housing crisis hasn't peaked, when do you think it will peak? Do you think you measure that in a matter of weeks? Do you think you measure it in a matter of months? Do you think you measure it in a matter of years?
Well, it depends on how you define the crisis, Deputy, to be fair. Like, if you define the crisis as having families in emergency accommodation, very regrettably, there are going to be families in emergency accommodation for quite some time to come, because we have to build the houses for them or find them on the rental market. And at the same time, we've got to strengthen the rental market, and that takes a few months in terms of passing laws and those laws bedding down to try and increase the preventions from people falling into emergency accommodation. There are many different ways to measure this crisis. If you measure the crisis in terms of housing output, we are currently in the last quarter, 4,500 new homes were built. At a steady state, disregarding pent-up demand, what you want is about 6,000 homes per quarter. Taking into account pent-up demand, you probably want about 8,500. So we're not that far off what we need to be producing in housing supply per quarter. So if you're defining the crisis in terms of output supply per quarter, we'll get to that point where we need to be in the course of next year in terms of enough homes being built per quarter to manage both what will be a stable state and pent-up demand as well.
Okay, on a simple yes or no, your ministerial colleague, Richard Bruton, said in the Dáil the other night that it would take 5 years to get to grips with the housing crisis. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Well, I mean, you're quoting Richard out of context, and Richard was talking about the jobs plan, which when we came into the Dáil, we said we have a 5-year programme to fix jobs in our economy, and that was the structural problem in the economy coming out of the crisis years, which we're still dealing with, obviously, because of the legacy not only in our banking sector, but absolutely in our housing sector. And he was making the point that we came forward and said this would take 5 years. And it took less than 5 years, and we did more in those 5 years than we said we did. And all through that time, other parties in the Dáil voted against us in every measure that we did to create those jobs. And we are 2 years into rebuilding Ireland. I'm 16 months into my term of office. And so I don't think he was saying it would take another 5 years. I think he was comparing the 5-year Rebuilding Ireland plan and how it's being judged at the moment compared to how his action plan for jobs was judged even 2, 3, 3.5 years into the action plan for jobs. And it was successful.
Maybe check the record of what he actually said. Okay, I want you to imagine something here. I want you to imagine that sitting across me here at this committee aren't these three guys over here. I want you to imagine that sitting across me here is a 25-year-old woman. When she was 18, Fine Gael came into government. So you've been there for 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, despite her having educational qualifications and ambitions, what she wants to do with her life, she can't afford to buy, she can't afford to rent, She's forced to live at home with her parents, even though she doesn't want to. And she's sick of the talk, and she's seriously thinking now of getting involved with the Take Back the City campaign. You've been there for 7 years since she was 18. What would you say to her? You're looking across the table at her, what would you say?
Yeah. Deputy, I don't need to imagine that. I meet people every week who are hurting from this crisis at the coalface, every week, because I'm the Minister for Housing and I'm responsible for fixing this crisis.
What would you say to the woman?
Deputy, I'm answering your question. You want to engage in false theatrics, that's for you. I'm just going to answer your question, okay? I know that people are suffering, I know that they're hurting, and that's why we're trying to help them. You are incredibly wrong if you think that back in 2011, people were predicting that we would be where we are now. If you think, imagine this, Deputy Barry. Sorry.
Between Deputy Barry
Right,
and
imagine this. In 2012, house prices were still falling, plunging hundreds of thousands of people into negative equity. We had 3,000 ghost estates. We had a massive deficit that we had to correct to get us to a stable state. If the government was proposing then to try and borrow, which it couldn't, billions more to build housing, it wouldn't have lasted in office. In 2014, we came out of a bailout and everyone said there'd be a second one. And only now are we managing to correct that deficit. But still, 2 years ago, we embarked on a very ambitious plan to rebuild housing. And that is what we're doing. Of course, we're playing catch-up. This crisis was more than a decade in the making. And we've gone from crisis to crisis in housing in this country for decades. That's why this government, as well as putting in immediate responses to the crisis, is also planning long-term, like Project Ireland 2040 and like the Land Development Agency, to make sure that no future generation suffers from the kind of crises that the last two generations, which I straddle, have, while at the same time helping to protect those generations as much as we can. I think it's important that people in a functioning democracy protest. I think it's important that they take to the streets and they get outraged about what is happening in here, because it means that they are paying attention and they care. And too often in our past, and particularly leading up to the crisis, not enough people were paying attention either in here or outside of here to some very bad decisions that were being made. Since the crisis, we've had much greater political engagement, public engagement in what's happening politically. We've had great change brought about by the people in terms of marriage equality, repeal of the 8th. Very important things have happened. I hope people continue to engage on this because they need to, because it's important that we all understand where we've come from and where we need to get to.
I suspect that your answer wouldn't cut it with the young woman, but I also suspect that you raised the idea of protest. I think she would be seriously looking at going down that road at this stage after 7 years, but in any case, I'll drive on. You mentioned earlier on that there was 9,527 officially homeless with the new figures for August. How many people have been recategorised since the recategorisations began a number of months ago?
So, Deputy, I have a summary of the survey that was conducted, and I can give it to members of the committee when we finish up here, because I asked someone to print it up for me as I was leaving that meeting. You will recall that I think it was in February or March, I had concerns about the high number of what were seen to be new presentations over that period of time. When we did a deeper dive with the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, we encountered this categorisation error, where people were miscategorised. Numbers were reflected of those categorisation errors as we uncovered them in, I think, the March and April reports. And then I asked for a group of people to go and do a much more detailed survey of each local authority to try and get a proper understanding of how we were counting people and where they were.
And the number of recategorisations is?
I have that in the survey. So at the time, I think the March and April figures, I think it was about 800 people, and we didn't know when those errors had occurred. We didn't know when they had been miscategorised. People in homes, their own homes. Deputy, if you understand this completely, I'm talking about people who were in their homes as renter, never went into emergency accommodation, stayed in their own homes.
I'm just looking for a number.
But because
I'm just
trying to explain it to you. You know, if you want to be kind of like,
You've been explaining for 2 minutes now. I'm just looking for a number.
You want to do this act, you want to play it up for the cameras, that's fine. I'm going to answer this question as you asked it to me. People who never left their own homes, right? So we're never in emergency accommodation, it shouldn't be counted as emergency accommodation. And when I discovered that, I said, how much more of this is happening? A survey has been done, it has been completed, a summary was given to me. and it reflects a number of. I gave the number earlier on.
Just not a very number, Mr.
Did you get the number when I gave it to you earlier on in my opening comments?
9,527. I'm asking how many have been recategorised.
And I gave you that
since
number.
The recategorisation began.
Did you not take a number when I gave it?
Could you say it again?
Yeah, I gave a number of the recategorisation summary survey. Said 741 homes had been identified, or 741 people have been identified who were in homes counted as emergency accommodation when they're not in emergency accommodation, and that's in addition to the recategorisations that were discovered, the miscategorisations in March and April earlier this year. I have a survey summary to be published. I literally left the meeting to come down here to committee.
Okay. My final
at the
question.
end of the meeting.
My final question is this: the spend on HAP last year, 149 million. The spend on HAP this year, 301 million. It's more than doubled. The people who will join the Raise the Roof protest outside the gates here next Wednesday at 12:30 have a simple demand. I think actually it's an extremely modest demand to double the capital spend, 2.3 billion. Why are you doubling the spend on HAP, which will end up in the pockets of landlords, rather than doubling the capital spend to provide social homes to people who will have them from there on in?
Deputy, what do we do for the people who need our support and we don't have the homes built for them yet and we can't get them built in 4 months' time? What do we do for them? Do we tell them to get lost? Or do we say, here's HAP and we'll help you with a place finder, find a home and you'll be safe there and we're going to build homes at the same time? What do we do for them? I can't just cut off HAP and put it into build. People they'd have nowhere to stay. So we'll continue to support people with HAP, but we'll continue to build as well. And last year I redirected 30% of the funding under Rebuilding Ireland towards build.
But even if you wanted to double
rather than
HAP,
acquisition.
But even if you wanted to double HAP, why wouldn't you double build?
But as I'm
So
saying,
the last word on this.
as I'm
30
saying,
seconds.
Deputy, 30% funding was redirected last year from my decision to build more, to increase the stock of social housing, and the capital funding for local authorities will go up next year, as per the programme funding under Rebuilding Ireland. So will the HAP spend, because I'm not going to leave people who need our support. We'll have them into private tenancies and we'll also build homes for them as well.
That's good.
Thank you, Minister. I heard what you said. The Senator Conway.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to welcome the Minister here today, and like Senator Boyhan, I'd like to congratulate him on Wednesday night. I think he brought a lot of clarity to people's minds in terms of where we are with this crisis, what has been done, where we are in terms of fixing it, and what the plans are to actually deal with it. And I think that's what people are more interested in, to actually know that things are happening. And I have often said, and I'll say it again, houses take time to build. Yes, we don't have enough of them, but they are being built, 4,500 in the last quarter. So I think that certainly speaks volumes. What I would like to ask the Minister, I have a few issues that I'd like to raise with him. Does the Minister and his officials have any plans for a tenant purchase scheme? I'm not convinced that tenant purchase schemes necessarily are the right thing to do, but it is something that has been flagged, and I think that what is the latest situation in terms of tenant purchase schemes? Is there plans to develop a tenant purchase scheme? In terms of HAP and in terms of basically the cap for social housing, I agree with what others have said. In County Clare, it's 25,000 for a single person, it's 30,000 for a couple. I think that needs to be raised, and raised significantly. There are people who are falling beneath the threshold because of very small figures, and maybe what we need is some flexibility. We need the cap raised in the first instance to realistic levels, especially with the way rents are going as well, and so on. But we probably do need some flexibility that individual cases and circumstances would be taken into consideration, particularly if there was children who possibly would have been illness or sick for various reasons. I think that flexibility at local authority level is something that should be looked at. Maybe it has been, maybe it's going to be, I don't know. In terms of traveller-specific accommodation, I get a sense that local authorities aren't pitching to your department in terms of making cases for purchasing houses for large traveller families. Housing is a crisis in the travelling community. It does need special attention. There are families of 6, 8, 10 children in travelling communities in local authority areas that are on the housing list and need to be accommodated. I do think that, again, we need flexibility both at local authority level and at the department in terms of the local authorities applying to the department for funding to purchase houses for members of the travelling community. I think we need a much more focused approach in terms of dealing with that. Vacant home taxes is something I agree with. I think that we need to adopt probably a more of a stick approach than a carrot approach. The fixing up and renting out of the properties, that scheme, yes, it's a good one, but I do believe that there's a lot of vacant properties out there that if there was a vacant home tax, it would focus the mind. So it's something that I think should be looked at in the context of the upcoming budget. Also, I do believe that we need to look at some sort of a levy for holiday homes and properties that are never rented out. If an individual can afford to have a holiday home, well, I do believe then that they should be in a position to pay a special levy on that property, which then could be used to channel into the pot to help with the crisis that we have. And there are thousands of them out there. And it's something that I've spoken to Pascal Donoghue about, and it's something that should be looked at. And you won't get too many people advocating for more tax, but in this particular case, I've seen it, and I do believe it's something that should be looked at. In terms of the turnaround time between local authorities and your department, I think the objective is 59 weeks from the inception of the discussions on a scheme of houses to actually getting it ready to a position of being shovel ready. In order to achieve that, I think there has to be better synergies between the local authority and your department. There's too many and too much referring back for more information, and when a scheme is sent up by the project teams in the various local authorities, that they are being filleted. Gentlemen, would you mind?
Sorry, colleague.
Yeah, that there should be some sort of maybe standardised spec to a degree that could be looked at, because unfortunately local authorities find it very difficult to meet the 59-week kind of target date, target time frame, because of the amount of intricacies coming from the department. That's what I've been told at local authority level anyway.
Thanks, Senator, for that contribution, and just to thank you as well for the recent visit that I made to Clare and the number of different sites that we got to visit in terms of what's happening there and proposals coming down the line for housing, because it's good to see it on the ground. The tenant purchase scheme, we've been working on this. We're going to come to a conclusion, on this very shortly. I spoke to Damien English about it yesterday. I understand the points that have been made by academics in this area, and the Taoiseach made only yesterday, I think, about losing stock of social housing while we're trying to increase it. I do think that the aspiration to home ownership must be there for all of our citizens, so we're trying to find the right balance. The current scheme is not the right balance, so something will come on that very, very shortly. In relation to HAP and social housing eligibility, as I said, I think in the Chamber, or maybe it was in the committee earlier today, it was actually in the committee, sorry, to the first contributor. The Housing Agency is leading on that review. It will be concluded very shortly. It should have been concluded, but it needed just a little bit more time. It will be done shortly. Just in relation to HAP in your own area, Senator, there's been 1,272 homes HAP'd in Clare, 22.2% available to discretion, which is the 20% uplift, which is about 283 homes. And what I think is interesting is the rate of discretion on average was 18.7%. which is actually quite high when compared to other local authorities. So that would point to pressures around HAP in your own local authority area. I have a more detailed report that we gave to the committee, so I'm sure you have it in your file, but just to point that out for you there, it goes into a bit more detail as well. for your own local authority, but I won't read that out now.
That's right.
In relation to traveller-specific accommodation, we are encouraging local authorities to do more and to give better attention here. We have a number of families in emergency accommodation, too many, I have to say. We are having problems, or sorry, local authorities are having problems when they do try to place families in terms of objections being raised locally. And that's something that we are trying to deal with as best we can.
On the specifics with traveller accommodation, I'm dealing with one case where there's a family of 6, 4 of them have special needs, and there doesn't seem to be any movement at the local authority to look at purchasing a house, because what would be required is going outside what the thresholds are. So again, what I'm looking for is for you to direct the local authorities to be flexible and to think outside the box. And if you're talking about a property being 50 or 100,000 greater, if it's accommodating a family of 7 or 8 people, well, it should be looked at seriously.
Senator, yeah, I can't direct local authorities when it comes to their allocations, but if you've got a particular case in mind, which we couldn't obviously discuss publicly for privacy reasons, you might bring it to my attention. In relation to the vacant home tax, this is something that actually I wanted to do when I came into office. One of the first things that I talked about, and I think the Taoiseach talked about it as well when he appointed me. When we actually looked at the data and looked at the detailed information ourselves, using people in the department, but also using some of the local authorities that were well advanced in terms of their vacancy research and their vacancy teams, it actually wasn't the low-hanging fruit that we thought it was, notwithstanding the fact that there's a significant amount of money, tens of millions in the department available to open up vacant homes and get them used again. And that is happening, though not as quickly as we'd hoped it would. The recent report by Indicon says that we need to keep the possibility of a tax under review, and I will do that. But as for a vacant home tax in the next budget, that won't be happening. In relation to a levy on holiday homes, it's interesting that you're proposing more taxes. I think Pascal Donoghue would appreciate your suggestions. The LPT has already paid on holiday homes, and there are no proposals at the moment to increase any kind of levy on holiday homes that are out there at the moment. In relation to the 59 weeks and shovel-ready, 59 weeks is good if you're talking about big sites. You know, now I mentioned to Deputy O'Brien earlier on about, well, maybe we need to look at something around stage 1, and that's something that I'm doing as well at the moment. But if you're talking about 40, 50 homes, 59 weeks, planning, design, procurement, all the different things that have to happen is actually quite good. There's currently 4,600 homes under construction on site at the moment, social housing homes, and there's 1,500 about to go on site who've come through that process. So we've designed it with the local authority chief executives. Those who know what they're doing are working into 59 weeks. Not every local authority is working at the same speed. That's why we have the housing summits, and that's why we have increased the number of staff and local authorities in housing sections by about 700 people over the last 2 years across the country. But we are constantly approving more project officers, programme managers, and they're being billed to our own department, because we are saying if you've got a site that can get a lot of homes built and you want to put someone particularly on that particular case to get this working, we will pay for it, and that is happening. Thank you.
Just finally, just in terms of the housing aid for older people and the housing adaptation grants, there has been a situation, I suppose, in recent years where there was an additional allocation made to certain local authorities, perhaps because other local authorities hadn't spent their allocation by, let's say, September, October, or alternatively money was found within the department that was directed. I don't know what exactly the specifics were, but is there any proposal in 2018 to give a top-up to local authorities who have lists of people looking for housing adaptation grants, aid for elderly grants, etc. And is it planned to increase the funding further for the 2019 budget?
I might just let Deputy Casey come in, and Minister, give time to answer that at the end, because we've gone over. Pat?
Okay, yeah, I'll try and be as brief as possible, just in relation to a few specific things. Just in relation to HAP Place Finder process, and I think it's a huge benefit to any county that has it. 14 counties or 14 local authorities have indicated that they wish to set up a HAP Place Finder and to set up one. How many of them have actually been are now in place and up and running? In the mortgage to rent scheme that was, in Q2 there, have we received any applications for that mortgage to rent scheme? The rural housing relocation, I don't know whether there's any take up on that or whether there's any real justice behind it, or has any other ways of being considered in relation to facilitating relocating of people? The rental pressure zones, the review process that I think started last year, I think it was summer last year we started the review process. Where is that at, and when can we see some proposed amendments to the rental pressure zones criteria? Because I think or have I missed something during the summer? Maybe.
I'll come back.
Yeah. Because I think there's a number of landlords out there that have been caught at the bottom end of the market that want to stay in it, but because they're given so low rent, have no option but to find ways of getting out. And I think we could keep some landlords in the market with some subtle changes to that. You've already spoken about the repair and lease scheme, and I think it's a huge, it's disappointing that it hasn't been taken up, being honest with you, because there mightn't be that many vacant properties that you're seeing around Dublin, but I know in every rural town there's a huge amount of vacant properties, and we're seeing them on a daily basis. And I don't know whether the scheme just wasn't promoted enough, or there wasn't enough information out there on it, or I'm not too sure why it hasn't worked either. But I'm looking at vacant properties on the streets every day, and I'm saying we could have families in these, and I just don't know what we need to do to get them across the line. I know there's complications through the planning process and regulation around that. I'll congratulate David on his appointment there, and I'll ask the next question so we can keep a marker on him when we have the next quarterly update. How many housing developments to date have progressed through the fast planning process? How many have been granted, and how many have been refused in relation to that? Just a quick one on student accommodation. You had a target of just over 8,600, and to May this year you have 3,000. Are you happy enough that you'll hit the target within the year? And just in relation, you also said you would review the differential rent scheme in relation to social housing, and I don't see any update on that. Just in relation to the fourth stage process for the approval of social housing projects. Mary's smiling now. Anyway, how many actually have gone through it in the 59 weeks? Or what is the average it actually takes to go through the fourth stage process? Because just on a quick calculation of the Q2 2008 that's just been released, there's 143 projects at stage 1. We've one of them there since 2013. We've 2 there since 2014. We've 19 sitting at stage 1 since 2015. We've 13 at stage 1 process since 2016. We've 6 Q1 17 and 11 Q2 17. That's 36% of the projects sit at stage 1 appraisal for over a year. So I'm just wondering, and I think it's an area, and I understand you've done a review of that, and I think you published a document that wasn't able to find it. I think there's, from my interaction with my local authority, there's ways that can be tweaked, and I think they've made that submission to you, so maybe you could have an update on that. You've mentioned the National Planning Framework 2040, and I'm mentioning this in relation to housing and housing development in relation to a housing crisis. And it's in relation to the proposed regional strategy that's coming down the road, and the impact it will have on my own county, and I believe counties like Kildare and Meath. And if it's what's indicated in the roadmap that has been published by your department, in relation, I'll give you the example in relation to Wicklow Town itself, which has invested over 100 million in critical infrastructure to allow housing development to happen, including the Port Access Road, upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant and the water service. So with all the infrastructure is there. We don't need to go to LIHAF for it or anything. Our population target on the National Space Strategy was 26,000 under a county development plan launched last year, was 26,000. It's now going to be 17,000 under the roadmap that's been issued by your department. 17,000. That means Wicklow Town will not be able to grant planning permission for a home until 2026, and we have the critical infrastructure there. Now, if this is what's happening with this roadmap, it needs to be revisited before the draft document is published. Thank you, Chair.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the questions. Just to come back to quickly, if I could, the housing adaptation grants. I think 10,000 have been done this year, Senator, and I can't give the figure in terms of funding for next year because it's part of budget negotiations, and my apologies, I'm not trying to not give the information, it's just sensitive at the moment. I'm going to work backwards, if I might, Deputy Casey, through your questions. 2040, 1 million extra people, 550,000 new homes. The Land Development Agency will be a big part of that, 11 billion in funding for 110,000 social housing homes. You know all the numbers. The population projections that county development plans have been based on since 2006 massively overstated the potential increase in population in terms of what actually happens in that period of time. We have done very detailed and consistent modelling in terms of what we think the projections are going to be over the next 20 years. But what we have done in terms of designing the strategies for each part of the country is to take what we think the likely population increase is, to take what was the increase based on the, say, 2006 figures, which was massively overstated, and come to a midway point and then try and use that midway point as a guide as we transition. We will be coming back and reviewing our population targets every time there's a census to make sure that they're happening in track in terms of what we expected would be the outcomes. So 2021 we'll be able to take a look and see, well, are we growing the way that we thought we would? Are we growing more than we should be? But the key thing about Project Darragh 2040 is growing in the right places, not just growing. And if Wicklow can achieve the kind of growth that's set for it in terms of it happening in Wicklow, I think that's going to be something that we haven't actually seen in Wicklow for quite a while. So, you know, our officials continue to engage with each local authority and with the regional assemblies to make sure that people understand what we're trying to achieve here. And it is different from before. But we are putting in enough headroom, more than enough headroom, in case there is a more than anticipated increase in population, for example, in your own county. In relation to the 4 stages, if there are projects that are 2 or 3 or 4 years still at stage 1 or stage 2, there's a problem with that project, not with the process, or else it would have progressed. I mean, we have these checks and balances in place for a reason. They're not just sitting on a desk somewhere. It's to make sure, but you know what I mean? Like, but the impression's been given that, like,
a project sitting there 5 years, I wonder whether it should be there at all.
Right, but the project would have come from the local authority, right? So, you know, like someone was telling me about a particular design scheme going back and forth 11 times between the department. And I went and actually launched those houses, and they were fantastic. And so it was obviously a good thing that they went through the checks and balances they did, so we could get these really great new homes built. There's a reason why we do these things the way we do. There's a reason why we worked with local authority chief executives to get it down to 59 weeks, because we saw that it could be improved. And there's a reason now why I'm looking at the threshold for the 1-stage approval process to give greater flexibility to local authorities for smaller schemes. Differential rent review is almost completed. It's coming very shortly. Student accommodation, yes, I'm confident we will meet our targets. I think that's quite important that we do, because it takes pressure off other parts of the housing system. In relation to the fast track process, 5,443 residential units, 2,665 of which were homes, have been granted permission, 2,778 apartments as part of that 5,443, and 4,479 student bed spaces. Refused permission, a total of 1,575 residential units, and there's a breakdown between houses and apartments, 906 houses and 669 apartments. The fast track process, and I cited it earlier in the week, has been very, very successful for getting large-scale development approved far more quickly through the planning process, which is great. The repair and leasing scheme, regeneration in towns and villages is where this is going to be great, or something like it. But the reason why it's not working in towns and villages, and actually I think the Urban Regeneration Fund and the Rural Regeneration Fund, that $3 billion for the next 10 years under Project Darragh 2040, might be the way we actually get there. I've been at some schemes that have been kind of privately led by people who are kind of known in the public, you know, who've themselves taken on a property and made it home for themselves, and encouraged a friend to do the same in the village, and then taken a building and said, well, we'll turn that into a business hub or a place where people can have startups. All of these things are what we've asked local authorities to go and look at and see, well, how can we help? As I explained earlier, like the repair and lease scheme requires a particular set of conditions to exist for an individual person who owns the property before they might want to bring it forward. And initially we said 10 years for social housing, and no one really wanted to do that. And we've brought it down to 5 years for social housing. But it might be in certain parts of the country that there may not be enough of a demand for social housing, so it wouldn't work under that scheme. And is there something else that we can do instead? And so at the moment, I've asked the Attorney General to look and see, when it comes to CPO powers, can we CPO local vacant homes and then sell them? Not CPO them for social housing, and sell them. Some local authorities are doing it, but not all local authorities. So I'm going to get advice from the AG, and if we can issue that advice to every local authority, use your CPO powers. It's not a question of actually completing the CPO. It's more the threat of the CPO that will get that house back onto the market for anyone who's able to buy it, and that's something that we want to achieve. In relation to the potential loss, the RPZ review, yes, that was published the May or June of this year. It's on our website. I just made a note here because you said it about landlords as well. The potential loss of landlords is a concern. I've got to find a balance in everything that I do. That we can strengthen protections for renters, yes we can. We have to make sure that we're also getting more people in to invest in rental property as well. It's very, very important. Not just people here in Ireland, having 1 or 2 properties, but actually institutional investors as well. Rural relocation. So I've been talking to Minister Ring about this in terms of, it's something that Michael Harty brought to me my first kind of week or 2 in the job. Are there schemes that we can do? The previous scheme wasn't that successful, unfortunately, in terms of a lot of people fell out of it and went back actually to the cities that they come from. But there is stuff that we can do, and Minister Griffin brought a proposal to me as well that officials are looking at, and I kind of referenced it earlier on, but I didn't link it back to Minister Griffin, but whereby people could live a very, very short commute to somewhere like Tralee in a house that is currently in okay condition, with some money could be refurbed or brought back into use and is vacant at the moment. And again, not necessarily for social housing needs, but for anyone. And so we're looking at things in relation to that. Mortgage to rent, 72 so far this year in 2018, but there are 845 currently in the system. And in relation to the HAP Place Finder, 23 are now in place, following requests from local authorities.
Thank you, Minister. Richard?
Yeah, Minister, I'm part of the National Housing and Homelessness Coalition, which is involved in organising the protest next Wednesday, which I hope will see a very large turnout of people who are just fed up with this housing crisis and the way it is affecting them. And that housing coalition was set up, and I was involved when it was set up about 3 years ago. And it arose from just absolute frustration at the way in which the crisis was continuing to get worse, and nothing the government did seemed to do anything but make it worse again, and it has continued to get worse since that point. And while I don't want to talk too much about the past, because we have to solve this problem and talk about the future, it doesn't give me a lot of confidence when you make statements like nobody could have predicted in 2011 that this was going to happen. See, that frustrates the hell out of me, and it suggests to me that you've learned nothing, that this government has learned nothing, because we did predict it. And we said it very openly in the Dáil in 2011 when your department produced a document saying explicitly that there was no longer going to be big capital public housing projects. Okay, now anybody doubts that, just Google Department of Local Government and the Environment, June 2011 housing policy, and you'll find it. And I remember holding a briefing over in Buswell's Hotel, where I had to try and explain to journalists who didn't know anything about this stuff at that stage what RAS was. We didn't have HAPS then, but we had RAS. And I tried to explain to them how what this statement meant was that the government were abandoning formally the direct construction of council housing in favour of outsourcing to the private sector through RAS or a new scheme that would be very similar to RAS. Okay, and that was said in the Dáil, and I'll send you over the press statement I sent out that week if you want, where we warned this was going to cause a housing crisis, because even then, you didn't have to be a prophet to work this out, even then there was 96,000 families on the housing list, so it was obvious, if you didn't build council houses anymore, there was going to be more, it was obvious. Something that was also said by many people in the Dáil in the following year was the decision to allow NAMA to unload vast amounts of property to vulture funds was going to be a disaster. So I really think you should withdraw that statement and recognise there was a mistake made. It was a mistake to stop building council housing and to make that formal decision. And would you agree, I wouldn't mind you answering this too, would you agree is, in retrospect, even if you didn't see it at the time, although some of us warned it, it was a mistake for NAMA to flog off all those land and assets. Given that, we now see a very significant portion of the people who bought those assets, those land and property assets, from NAMA, sitting on land, speculating on land, flipping land, and ratcheting up rents and property prices through their activities. I mean, wasn't that a mistake? And the reason I think it's important to say that is because although you say we're now going to ramp up the level of direct construction of council housing and so on, the proportion of social housing solutions in your Rebuilding Ireland plan that are dependent on the private sector still remains the overwhelming majority of those targets. So, out of the Rebuilding Ireland targets, about, 90,000 of the 137,000 are RAS or HAPS or leasing. Now, I mean, in what sense have you broken from the policy that was started in 2011, if that is what your plan is? And do you have anything to sort of say about the IGES report that came out from the Department of Public Expenditure that is warning that not only, as we are saying, that won't deliver secure social housing for people, but it rather will deliver very precarious housing which people can be evicted from, but also that it's going to cost the state an absolute fortune as the bill for paying RAS and HAPS payments to private landlords, who, as we can see, are jacking up rents month after month after month, it gets bigger and bigger and becomes a massive hole in the public finances.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. I mean, what were people predicting in 2011, if we could just go back for a moment? Well, first of all, they were predicting that NAMA had overpaid for the loans and it was going to make a massive loss on the 32 billion in bondholder money that it was covering. They were also predicting that the coast estates, all of them, would have to be bulldozed. They were predicting that the recovery on jobs would take more than 10 years, that there'd be a second bailout. But this is all what was being predicted at the time.
I wasn't predicting any of that, so please answer the questions I asked you.
Congratulations on being able to see the future so well, okay? If you weren't predicting all of that, because all I can remember from the left at the time was nothing but doom-saying that things are only going to get worse. And if you didn't say that NAMA had overpaid...
I'm talking about housing, what was said about housing.
I'm talking about the context of 2011, because it's very important that we remember the context in which we were in. We can't pretend that we came to this crisis from a perfect position, because we didn't. We came to this current crisis in housing from a national economic crisis and a previous housing crisis. One led directly into the other. And we have to understand that.
You're not answering the question. Was it a mistake?
You asked a 5-minute question. You're going to get a 5 minutes.
Sorry, Matt, we've gotten through 2 hours of a really good debate where nobody has been interrupting, and I really don't want to start it now. So, Richard, if you'd allow the Minister to answer without interruption, has he allowed you to ask your questions without interruption, and then we can proceed. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. We all knew that the cuts that were made to the capital budget at the time would create future risks for this country. We knew that, but we had to do it to protect current spending, people's salaries, their pension payments, their social welfare protections. That was a decision that was made at the time. I was a backbencher in government. I stood fully behind it. And it was the right decision to make when you look at what has happened. But unfortunately, there has been an underinvestment in housing. The Fine Gael government in 2011 didn't make the decision to almost exclusively outsource social housing building to the private sector. We're the ones who've actually corrected that decision and brought that responsibility back into the state, back into the allocation of taxpayer resources. That's why we sit here and we talk about how we're going to spend $6 billion. I thought we'd sit here and talk about more than $11 billion in the National Development Plan for social housing, for increasing the stock of social housing. We cannot rely exclusively on one stream of delivery for anything, or else we'll become overexposed, potentially in a future crisis. It's very important that we do that. And so when we look about increasing the stock of social housing, we look about the 50,000 that we have and the numbers that you know, there's a multiplicity of streams that are there. Direct building, local authorities, housing bodies, acquisitions as well, of course, it's important. Regeneration is in that too. Long-term leasing, all of these things.
Down the clock now, Owen, to be honest. I asked you a question.
I will give him extra time.
I've just asked you a question. What else did you have in
I asked you about NAMA. Was it a mistake to flog off all the property?
First of all, I'm not responsible for NAMA.
I'm just asking, was it a mistake for NAMA to flog all the property?
I don't agree with the premise of the question. I don't agree with the premise of your question.
Okay. So you don't have to answer that
Yeah,
question.
well, I don't agree with the
Okay,
premise,
fair enough,
if I can,
fair enough.
you know.
Okay, I want to ask another question. Right, and it's about building council estates and the attitude your government is currently taking to building council estates. And I just mention in passing that Brendan Kenny said that there was no doubt it was quicker to build just council estates than to have to do this mix that you insist on, right? He said that yesterday because you just had one place to go to get the money instead of having to go and borrow money as well for the private and affordable bits. Okay, so I'll just say that in passing. Why does your government have this attitude about council estates, about that you can't just build a big council estate? Could you just explain that to me? And could you ask if you know you think there's a problem with building council estates as we have in the past? Do you think there's equally a problem with, I don't know, building private estates where you've loads of rich people all hanging out together? I mean, to me, it's just blatant snobbery.
Well, yeah.
Before you come in, because you weren't here for the meeting yesterday, but 4 of us were here, and what Brendan Kenny said, again, is not in full context.
Sure, no, fine.
What he said was the funding source for social housing is one source of funding, affordable is separate. But building 1,000 social houses would not be the right thing to do, but yes, it would be easier from a financial point of view. And it was along... No, you didn't say quicker. It's the same lead times. You can look back at the blacks, but just put into context what he did say.
Well, thanks for clarifying that, Chair. I think it's very helpful to actually put things in context. I know that Deputy Barrett didn't want to maybe do that. I believe in mixed communities, absolutely. That's a principle for Fine Gael building into the future. We want to build sustainable mixed communities. We don't want to divide or segregate people. We want to unite and support them. And that's what we're doing. And when you look at the ambitions around the Land Development Agency, for the first time in the history of the state, any state land that is going to be brought forward for the development of housing is going to have locked into it at least 10% social and at least 30% subsidised housing. But across the portfolio of lands, 50% will be social and subsidised / affordable. It doesn't mean the other 50% won't be affordable. It'll depend on where it's been built and the point in time in the market, and we're talking about the next 20 years. But we're bringing forward massive tracts of public land that might never be made available for housing for the general public. That's a good thing, and that's what Fine Gael is doing in government.
Correct.
Thank you, Minister. With the agreement of the committee, we're 2 hours now sitting. Can we just suspend for 5 minutes to let just take a break for 5 minutes? Is that agreed?
Thank you, Chair.
Deputy O'Brien.
Chair, thanks very much, and thanks, Minister, for the answers to the other folks' questions, because some of them are very interesting. Look, just a couple of follow-ups. So, look, I'm looking at the homeless figures for this month and last month that are now on the web, and I've had 2 quick reads of the reclassification report. And my questions are just factual, so again, we'll come back to the substance of this at a later committee meeting. But so there has been a decrease of adults in emergency accommodation from July to August of 190. And there's been a decrease of children in emergency accommodation by 80, according to the figures that have been published. When I look at the reclassification report, if I'm reading it right, it's saying that somewhere between the survey and now, for that report, an additional 741 adults and children have been recategorised as not in emergency accommodation, etc. So I suppose what I'm trying to understand is, at the opening of your remarks, you said that there were 238 new presentations in August and 83 exits. I think that's in Dublin as opposed to statewide. So can you confirm that the decrease, the 270 decrease, at least some, and possibly all of that, is as a result of the recategorisation of people as not being homeless because of your view in terms of the accommodation that they're in? That's the first question. I know you don't have the exact number, but of that 170, of the 170 decrease of, the 270 decrease of adults and children, some of that, and possibly all of it or a lot of it, is as a result of reclassification rather than exits from homelessness in August. And I know Mary doesn't have the detailed breakdown of the months that those 741 came out, but if you give us a commitment that you'll provide us with that when you have it, that would be good. The second thing is, and this is just, again, it's a categorisation question, so I'm not going to get into the politics of that. We'll do it at a later stage. In your recategorisation report, your argument is that you discovered that there were families in accommodation that was owned or rented or leased by the local authority. And therefore, in your view, that's not emergency accommodation, and I understand your argument. My question is, how are those units different from hubs or the likes of Talacross, which are owned or leased by the local authorities? Because I'm not clear on how you're making that distinction. And then just a couple of follow-ups. Student accommodation. The Residential Tenancies Board made a very, very important determination just a couple of weeks ago. I've just emailed it to you. Not that I want you to comment on the determination now, but I think you need to pay attention to it. It was one of the court cases in Galway of the very significant rent increases. Now, while the determination found that the individual who took the case didn't have standing because they weren't in a tenancy at the time and therefore weren't subject to the RPZs, there are two really important findings in that report, in that determination. The first is it says that the student licences that exist in that location are regarded as tenancies by the Residential Tenancies Board, and that if somebody had a tenancy now that was subject to something more than the 4%, that they would be covered and protected by the rent pressure zone legislation. What I'm asking you to do is maybe study that determination with your team in advance of whatever yourself and Mary Mitchell O'Connor are going to bring forward at a later stage in terms of student accommodation, because I think that has real material bearing on the conversations we've been having. What it basically says is student licences in purpose-built student accommodation are regarded under the terms of the RTA as tenancies and have the RPZ protection. And then just finally on the four-stage process, I suppose the one thing I don't agree with is that the process can't be improved, and we had officials yesterday, and many of us have spoken to officials previously in terms of this. For example, there is an argument that some senior officials and local authorities talk about that you could look at moving towards a two-stage process. You could have less of the duplication and back and forth between local authorities and the department in terms of design and in terms of cost approvals, and that could shorten it down, particularly in light of the fact that whatever about the cost approvals between the department and the local authorities, the market ultimately determines the cost in the tender process. The second thing is I'm talking to professionals in the field and academics in the field around just procurement rules, who are far more expert about this than I would be. And they're strongly advising that there must be a way within the legal framework that the government has to operate on, that localised or regionalised framework agreements, for example, that currently operate for maintenance contract, could be applied to small and medium-sized social housing build, so that not every single project has to go out to a new round of tenders, but that, for example, you could have a group of contractors sitting on the shelf to whom works could be handed out to. Whether or not that's possible, I don't know, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And then just the last thing, and we're going to have a dedicated session on the LDA so we can talk about that, but my one big concern, and you know my view, which is I'd like to see council-led mixed income and mixed tenure estates, so we're not disagreeing on the mixed tenure element of it. My one concern is that if in the round the LDA only delivers 10% social, that we will be unable to meet the level of social housing output that's required. So I'd like to know the rationale, and again it's just a factual question, not a political argument, the rationale for setting the 10% figure. I know some sites might have more or less, but all of the documentation and all of the commentary you've said in the public domain is that 10% is what the target is. Surely, given the level of need and the ambitious targets that you say you have for social housing delivery under the NDP, surely more than 10% would be a minimum requirement, because otherwise all we're going to have is 10% of the big sites and small infill on council sites, and therefore we simply won't have the capacity to meet the limited targets, as I see them, that you've set for yourselves.
So, Minister.
Thanks, Deputy. Thanks, sir. So in relation to the recategorisation summary that I received earlier today, and which it's been published, you've seen it? Yeah, great. 741 were recategorised, as it says in that report, and it talks about the different parts of the country where that's happened. I don't know exactly when that's happened, and I've said this before when we came across this issue, when I've talked about the collection of the homeless numbers in general. We're not dealing with a perfect collection system here in terms of collecting data and reporting data. I'm not criticising anyone in the local authorities on this. The past system that's there is complicated to use. It was never designed for this type of thing. And we've recognised that we could be capturing a lot more data, actually, as people come in, so we can put in place even better preventative measures and those types of things. And so there's a piece of work underway now to do that, and the CSO are helping in that piece of work, which I think is very, very important. I did say, and apologies, it's just written on a note when I was coming from the meeting, the number of presentations was down on July, so 238 presented. 114 were prevented. The exits, which is 83, relates to the exits in Dublin only, so it's not the total exits nationally. The total number of people who are in emergency accommodation, the overall number, is lower than we thought it was. It's 9,527 individuals, that's adults and children. But I don't know exactly when they happened, so I can't really comment on that. But we are endeavouring to constantly be improving what we do. What I would say, and again I had a discussion with my officials about this, I've talked before about the publication of these numbers and making sure that we are publishing accurate numbers. It's very, very important. A huge amount of time and resources go into that. And I need to try and work with the people in my department and the people in local authorities to see how we can better improve the collection of data so that it's more efficient and it's better data that's collected, but also the publication of the numbers can be fair comparisons month on month. And it's very difficult for you to do that when we have this recategorisation work underway, when we've discovered these people living in homes who are being counted in the wrong way. In relation to the report itself, what we're talking about in these homes, which is, I think it has three categories from memory. One is local authority owned, one is AHB owned, and then one is either leased or by the local authority or the AHB. These are people who have their own homes, their own doors, their own keys. Very, very different to a family hub. You've been in family hubs, you know the type of setting that we're talking about.
But very similar to Talacross, you would accept. In Talacross, for example, people have an apartment, they have a key, they have 9, 12 or 18-month licence agreement. And there's 65 of those units. And again, I'm not looking to have a political row. I'm trying to understand the rationale.
I don't have a list of these homes. In certain cases, they're individual homes. So if I gave the list, you'd be able to know who was living there. So there's data. But when you talk about someone having a place to live for 2 years with their own door and their own key, they're in a home. That's not a person in an emergency.
I'm not having an argument with you about that.
Okay, well, that's the point I'm making.
My question, though, but this is quite important because it's just so that I understand the logic of the report. It's purely factual. Talacross, for example, are 65 units that were purchased from a debtor to NAMA by South Dublin County Council. South Dublin County Council took a decision to use them as emergency accommodation. It's managed, I think, by TUA. Families who present as homeless are placed in Talacross and they have a licence agreement, so it's emergency accommodation, but that licence agreement is 6, 9 or 12 months, during which time TUA work with them to place them in HAP accommodation or a council home. What I'm trying to understand is what is the difference between that arrangement and, for example, Waterford, who we know used some council stock to do something similar, or Louth, for example, who we know used private rental stock to do something similar. Can you explain to me the difference in terms of how you understand it of those?
Talacross, from my understanding of Talacross, although I haven't, in fairness, visited Talacross, I've visited a number of other locations, not Talacross, isn't a hub. It isn't a precarious tenancy at all. The landlord is the local authority. It is an arrangement with TUA. And people there are in their own homes, and they're going to be in their own homes for quite some time.
So have Talacross been recategorised out of emergency accommodation, the 741 figures?
So I got a summary of the report. I didn't see the actual data set of spreadsheets.
It's a summary, literally.
Okay, because my understanding is Talacross hasn't been recategorised, and this is my point, is that
I don't know. I know you want to speak to facts, but I don't actually have the fact on that. Definitely.
And then let me just press one thing then. Of the 270 adults and children who, of the reduction of 270 adults and children in the August figures, so there's 190 adults and 80 children less in emergency accommodation. Is it fair to assume that there is a possibility that some of those, it's not that they have exited homelessness, but it's that they have been recategorised under the change of your counting? Because it's just, people will see those figures published today. And for example, if that was just a straight reduction and those people are now in full-time tenancies, that's good news, right? But if people have been recategorised but they're still not in permanent tenancies, that is something different. And I'm just trying to again...
What I can say is that, this emphasis on permanent tenancies, I think, might be a bit of a misdirection, because often the people who are actually in these homes that we've identified are in more secure living arrangements than people in the private rental sector, because they will never be exited into homelessness. They will never find themselves in emergency accommodation, because the duty of care that is there on the local authority as the landlord means that they can't do that, right? So the second point I'd make is that the overall number of people in emergency accommodation is lower than we thought it was, because a significant number of people were actually in homes and not in emergency accommodation. Okay. And that's about as clear as I can be on it,
sure.
Deputy. In relation to student accommodation, an amendment is going to come. So what I think is going to happen with the rent bill, just because we're clarifying it, finalising it at the moment, is that we'll publish the rent bill And then at committee stage, we'll bring the amendment on the student side.
Okay.
So we've got time to work on the amendment on the student side, because I know we've had meetings on this.
Yeah.
I know how interested in it you are. In relation to shortening the approval process, the one thing that we're going to do, and one of the outcomes that came out of the Housing Summit, even though some people say these summits don't do anything, is we're going to agree an internal spec for social housing, which will shorten timelines, so that there can be a standard internal spec. I won't agree one on an external spec. I won't do that. But for internal spec, why not? And, you know, if you visited some of the new builds recently for social housing homes, they are fantastic. In relation to, again, another thing on this approval process, you mentioned the proposal around a two-stage. I think we can do more with the one stage, and I won't say any more than that, but I think we can do more with the one stage.
And on the framework agreements for the procurement?
Yeah, so on procurement, one of the first meetings I had as Minister was at the AG. I said, I need to get shortcut procurement. Well, I've been told, I've gone to him twice, that we can't. So he's obviously, that's his advice. I have to accept that advice based on European Union procurement law. But we have put in place procurement frameworks, right?
Just a practical question, and again, it's just factual. So if I'm a local authority, for example, and I want to have a tender arrangement with, for example, maintenance contractors, what I do is I put out a general call, I get a bunch of people to come in, and I agree 3 contractors who have a contract for 3 years or 5 years, and then I hand out the jobs as they come. Are you saying that the Attorney General has said that that type of arrangement is not possible for large-scale builds?
No. No, what I'm saying is that I wanted to basically say, this crisis is of such significance, I am parking procurement law. I wanted to do that. I wanted to say, I tested this with them. If we declare an emergency, will I be able to suspend procurement law? The answer was no, because the emergency had to be akin to a natural disaster.
Sure.
Right? So what we have done is we have set up under the OGP, the Office of Government Procurement, our mini procurement frameworks, particularly around rapid build, where we actually pre-procure a panel, and then we say to the local authorities, use rapid and use this panel. And we're putting in place, if it's not already been put in place, a new one for multi-storey rapid build.
And all I'd ask you to do is, because those are positive developments, if you applied exactly the same framework agreement, but if you did it on a regional basis for the new build, so for example, if there was one for Dublin, if there was one for the South West, that would mean that not every individual job for an infill development of 10, 20 or 50 houses would have to go out to tender. So you could have the same. All I'd ask you to consider doing, because again, this is what the officials are telling us, if they had those operating at a regional basis rather than in the way you have the centralised one for new builds, that could save a lot of time in terms of the tender process. And I just think that's worth exploring.
Yeah, so there's a shared services model that we pursue with local authorities, and I know that there are regional procurement frameworks in place for other types of services. I don't know if they are possible for capital construction, but I will take a look. And in relation to the LDA, it's likely going to take a similar approach in terms of having a pre-approved procurement frameworks for certain aspects of its work. And in relation to the social aspect of that, don't forget that local authorities will also be building on their own land, social housing, in conjunction with the LDA building on state land.
Sure, that I know. My question is, what was the rationale for choosing, for fixing on the 10% for the large sites?
Yeah, so the 10% is basically in line with the provision that we have around Part 5. But
these sites aren't subject to Part 5 because
they're
they're publicly owned.
No, but
you're saying they're publicly developed.
But when I look at what we have tried to achieve and what we're doing in relation to social housing, the first focus, if you like, of Rebuilding Ireland in terms of the work that was done was putting in place plans, preparations for massive social housing building framework and to do that social house building. And what we've been talking about for the 14 months since I've been in the job, in addition to that, is needing to do more on subsidised housing, which is a wider type of public housing, which is affordability. And so when I came to the LDA and we were designing it, I wanted to make sure that actually, as a big gun in terms of its big firepower, that it would be delivering more on the affordable side. Now, it's up to every site, how we do it, what actually mix will be obtained. On certain sites, it could be 30-20. You know, it's really going to depend.
So can I leave, and this is my final comment, Chair.
I'm allowing you going over because it's actually the detail is great for anybody watching.
And again, it's just a factual question. A number of the local authorities, including Brendan Kenny from Dublin City Council, were saying that past 2021, if they meet all of the social housing output targets, land is going to become a real issue for them. Now, some local authorities are in a better position than others. My concern is that if we max out all of the land on the existing social housing output programme, particularly through Part 8s and infills, etc., and if you stick to the 10% on the larger scale sites that are LDA, then we're going to have a big problem post-2021. just in terms of meeting your targets, which I think are too modest in the first place. All I'm urging you to do, and again we'll come back to this in the legislation, is think very hard about whether an overall 10%, we get into an argument about who does the development and stuff at a later stage, but whether 10% is in any way appropriate in terms of your obligations to meet your own targets in the NDP up to 2040, whatever else, because by my calculations, it's going to hamper you from delivering even those targets.
Yeah, I think in terms of what I've seen, Deputy, I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, I think we have identified enough land for social housing for local authorities to take us to at least 23 under the NDP ambition that I put into that plan. Obviously, I'm going to have to make sure that I can meet my targets that I put into Project Ireland 2040, because that's the most important thing, like, is that those homes get delivered into the stock of social housing. And so I'll make sure that we, as long as I'm in this job and as long as I'm responsible for this, I'll make sure that those commitments that were put into Project Ireland 2040 in the NDP, which I think are so important in terms of social housing delivery, that everything is done in tandem with that to make sure that they're met.
Thanks, Minister. Thanks, Eoin. Martin.
Yeah, just to follow on Owen's point, and I can see where he's coming from in terms of the 10%, but there is a growing crisis as well, which is in terms of Middle Ireland and the affordability of houses, and the only way to deal with that is just crack on with the construction of houses, and looking forward to the legislation when it does come. And certainly we can tease it out in far greater detail. Just come back, Minister, to the question I asked earlier on about the housing aid for the elderly and so on. One of the questions I did ask actually was, would there be a supplementary budget this year for local authorities based on other local authorities perhaps not spending their allocation, the monies that were allocated to them? I just think that's something very worthwhile. And there are certain counties where it would be very desirable if there was a supplementary budget like other years. In terms of that, perhaps your officials might be able to.
Thank you, Senator. So there won't be a supplementary budget, because we can actually move money around as necessary depending on how we are hitting our spend per year. So we constantly do a performance review in terms of what spending we're doing to see if we're on profile to meet the actual allocation that we've been given, to make sure that we spend the money that we have for the year and don't overspend, because then we would be in a difficult position, but certainly don't underspend when we're in a crisis. So if certain local authorities haven't been able to utilise this grant as efficiently as we would like, we can actually allocate additional money into other local authorities that might have a greater call, and we're doing a piece of work around that at the moment.
Okay, just in terms of housing for people with disabilities, and this is my second last question, are you satisfied in terms of the targets that you're hitting, or that you are meeting your targets in terms of specific accommodation for people with disabilities?
Well, a lot of the housing schemes that I've actually visited are adaptable. So we've made sure that we future-proofed them to either look after that person when they get to an older age and they mightn't be as mobile, or if someone were to have a child that might have particular needs. And how they're future-proofed is with wider door frames, with particular types of bathrooms that can be either easily adapted or don't need to be already because of the way that they've been designed in terms of kind of being washrooms as well. So I'm very pleased with some of the foresight that local authorities have had in designing some of these houses, and that does take a bit more time. I think it's good. In terms of our current targets around disability and what we're trying to do, Vinnie McGrath and I are in constant discussion about this, and constantly trying to figure out in terms of the allocation of funds and resources and whether we could achieve more or do better. I know he made an announcement around this very recently in relation to disability itself and in relation to housing. I think in the last 3 months, insofar as new funding was being made available for this. At the moment, we're looking at funding for next year.
Very good. And finally, just on another issue that's been brought to my attention, in terms of some of the homeless charities, like Simon and others, Focus in particular, have charity shops. and they are registered charities, but they are paying rates on these charity shops as well. Would you consider an amendment to the upcoming legislation that would exempt charity shops that are registered charities, properly registered charities, from rates? You'd only be talking about 2 or 3 million of a loss to local authorities, but what it would do in terms of equipping and enabling those particular organisations to continue the good work they are doing would be immense.
Thank you, Senator. We're reviewing rates legislation at the moment. That's being done by Deputy John Paul Phelan, or Minister John Paul Phelan, sorry. It's a responsibility that he has in the department, and we want to bring forward legislation on that soon, so we'll look at that in the fullness of time. I'll just declare very quickly a conflict of interest in that regard, because a family member of mine works in one of those shops, so, but he'll be responsible for all of that.
Richard, did you want to come back in?
I did, yeah. First of all, just on the latest figures, I mean, in total, there's, as I read it, there's 1,051 bills by the local authorities and AHB. At the end of quarter 2, 1,181 acquisitions. So in terms of build, the proportion of the output that is billed as against HAPS, RAS and leasing is about 10%. I mean, isn't that a pretty miserable output in terms of direct build? And even if you include the acquisition, we're still talking about 80% of your social housing output is still dependent on the private sector. I mean, it doesn't really give much credence to the suggestion that we're weaning ourselves off dependence on a private sector, particularly given that that private sector, as we see, is jacking up rents, and that's obviously going to inflate the cost that the state has to bear to pay for social housing that is dependent on this sector. And secondly, kind of relating to that, and this is where it comes down to the human level, you made a statement earlier on, if the state is paying your rent, your housing need is met. Now, do you honestly think that that is a fair comment for the very, very many people who find themselves in HAPS or RAS arrangements and then discover that the landlord is pulling out of that arrangement? This is happening regularly. They don't feel their housing need is met because it isn't met. It isn't secure. HAPS isn't secure. I mean, you could possibly argue that RAS has some security, although even there, we've had extreme difficulty in many cases in my area with people where landlords pulled out of RAS arrangements and the council saying, well, we can't actually find a new RAS arrangement. But how you can possibly argue that somebody in a HAPS arrangement as precarious as that, and where we have plenty of evidence of landlords pulling out of HAPS arrangements, how can you make that statement? And isn't it a bit of an insult to the people who find themselves evicted and then in hubs or in emergency accommodation, having been supposedly having their housing need met?
I think, Deputy, you've got to be so careful with the way that you talk about certain schemes that are there to help people. And I think there's a real risk of people undermining genuine supports that can really help people, insofar as that they don't take up a HAP offer and they find themselves in emergency accommodation when they could have been supported into a rented home. You know, I've met so many people who've been affected so badly by this crisis. I know that HAP hasn't worked for some people, but more than 40,000 tenancies have been created under HAP. 17,000 were created over that last year. HAP is working for tens of thousands of people. It is a very, very good support. It doesn't always work. Like in the private rental sector, not every tenancy will work out. But for the vast majority of people who are renting, who are actually able to rent, that's working for them. Of course we have challenges around not enough rental stock. Of course we have challenges around not enough time being given to people when a notice to quit is served, or rent transparency, or greater enforcement of rent pressure zones. All of these things that we're trying to address in the bill that's coming up, adding to the things that we've already done to try and strengthen and mature our rental sector. HAP has to continue until we've built more homes. And HAP is working for people, and the place finder model is working for people, and the uplifts are working. 20%, 50% for homeless HAP, the deposit, the first 2 months' rent. These supports are real, and they're making a real difference for tens of thousands of people.
Well, Minister, I mean, I would just say to you that that's not much consolation for the people who find themselves in that difficult situation. And don't get me wrong, you know, if HAPs are found, or if those options are given, when I have cases coming into me of desperate people, I ask them to seriously consider it. But I meet a lot of people
Seriously, consider them over what? Consider it over what, though? What's
whether
their
they should take a HAP if they're offered.
And then do what? Do what if they don't, though, Deputy?
That's a choice
Do what if they don't?
Owen, that's a choice they have to make. That's a choice they have to make with their family.
It's not
right?
much of a choice they have at the moment, Deputy, if they're struggling like that.
Well,
It really isn't.
in my opinion, a family...
If they don't have a home, HAP is on the table.
In my opinion, if a family has been on a housing list for 15 years and they're in a hub and they're not willing to put themselves in a precarious situation again, then I think they have an entitlement to say that's not good enough, as far as I'm concerned, right? Now, I'm not saying I encourage that, because I think people have to make those very personal, intimate decisions that are going to impact on their family themselves. But I think it's frankly insulting to tell them that if they make the decision that they're not willing to put themselves through that again, that they haven't got the right and entitlement to do so. That's my own view. But, you know, we leave that pass. But as long as we have reliance on HAPs, we are going to continue to have a stream of people, albeit a minority, but it'll be a significant minority, who find themselves again and again in trouble. To my mind, that is indisputable.
Well, I'll come back to your build point then, because you talked about an over-reliance on HAP and you're looking at the build table. It was the first question you asked me.
Yeah.
And if this level of output for the first 6 months of the year in terms of local authority build was going to continue for the rest of the year, that would not be good enough. But I know from my experience in this job last year how the programme was delivered over the course of the year and how it ramped up significantly quarter on quarter. This year, we will do 10 times the number of local authority build than we did only, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. It is ramping up significantly, and over the course of rebuilding Ireland, we will increase the stock of social housing homes by 50,000. And that's real, and that's going to help people, and it's going to take away from the over-reliance on HAP that we have at the moment. HAP will always be there. That kind of support in the private rental sector, using taxpayers' money to give state support to people, will always be there. But it shouldn't be there to the degree that it is now. It is, because we didn't come here from a perfect state. We came here from a crisis into a crisis. And we can't forget that, or else we'll make the same mistakes again in the future.
Well, look, I mean, that debate will continue, but as far as I'm concerned, as long as we rely on HAP, we're going to have problems. But can I ask you another question? Just, it sort of relates to the earlier contribution I made, but trying to concretise it in a particular example, which is very important, which is Cherrywood, right? Cherrywood, in my opinion, could solve the housing crisis in the Greater Dún Laoghaire area. But again, at the weekend, we have evidence that it's not going to, because the particular approach that not just you, but the government has taken over the last 10 years, i.e. that NAMA sold it to Hines, a supposed developer, and that supposed developer has now at the weekend announced that it's selling off 73 acres of that land and has walked away with a fortune, I don't know exactly how much, but it certainly bought...
I'll let you finish, but just be careful about naming people outside of the House.
It's in the newspapers on Saturday.
I'm just putting it on the record for you, all right?
Okay, fine, but it was in the newspapers on Saturday, so it's in the public domain, that they bought it, that land, Cherrywood land, from NAMA at a very low price, and now they are flogging it off, right? And no houses have been built. But they're walking away with a fortune, and no houses have been built. Now, does that bother you? That land they acquired from the state, that they are now flipping, they're going to walk away with a massive profit on a site that we could use for public housing. And would that lead you to conclude that maybe the state should consider taking back hold of that site? Or that even in terms of the 10%, the miserable 10% we hope to get it, that we might at least take our 10% up front in land and build on it ourselves, so we aren't reliant on when Hines or the next developer who buys it to speculate on it.
I think this is very dangerous territory, because we're actually moving into the realms of clearly identifying people.
This is in the public domain.
All in the public domain.
If the
Whether it
minister
is, no,
doesn't
Chair,
feel like he can have it, then that's okay.
whether it is in the public domain or not, that doesn't excuse this committee from going down the line of specifically identifying people.
Scrutinise this stuff with the greatest respect, Mark.
No, Richard, I'll allow you to continue.
We're not naming people.
But
These
it's
are
up to the-
organisations who receive the taxpayers' money, Martin, please.
But
The minister is fully aware
Censoring
when he
members
can
of this
and can't
committee is not what
answer
we're in the
to
business
that.
of doing.
Right.
And that's what you're proposing.
I'm not proposing that
Exactly
at all.
what you're proposing.
That's absolutely not proposing.
Members,
But we have to be fair
we
to
are
people
so
as well.
close to the end of the meeting. I'll be very amicable.
This is my last question, if I could just get it out without interruption.
You just let me finish, Richard, without interruption. I actually haven't asked any questions because I've given my time to you as a non-member today, okay? We're so close to the end of the meeting. It's been a very amicable meeting. The Minister and the members are fully aware of who they can and can't mention. I've put you on warning with that. Richard, you can finish asking your question and we're going to finish then with the Minister.
I want to ask you, does it concern you that that could happen with this STZ and land that was previously in state ownership and that has such importance for delivering housing? But does it also, when you see that flipping of land happening, does it also prompt you to think that we cannot afford to wait to get the public housing we want on that land for whenever the next developer decides to build or not to build, given there's clear evidence now of speculation on this land? Shouldn't we take as much as we can get now and build ourselves on it, or God knows what's going to happen on that site? We might never get stuff, it might be drip fed, it's certainly going to be way down the line if we're dependent on whoever just fancies buying that for whatever purposes.
I think we get the point. Minister?
Thanks, Chair. And just, if I may, I think in fairness to Senator Conway, he was just trying to make sure that no one might accidentally or intentionally abuse their privilege, as has happened before in committees and chambers. But I can answer the question. You know, it bothers me when I don't see houses being built on sites that are ready to be built on. It does bother me, of course it does. You know that there are more complications to this land than might perhaps be evident in the context of your question. A number of landowners across a large site. You know that significant investments have actually been made in that site already. That wasn't all taxpayer money, by the way. And so investments have been made, and investments can be returned. That's how these things work. But of course, it bothers me when houses aren't being built. But this is exactly why I've brought forward the Land Development Agency. And I think we all need to park our ideology at the door, whether you're from the left or the right. You're against the private sector building houses at all. I mean, if we didn't have people building houses in the country, but that's exactly why we're bringing forward the Land Development Agency. So we're not depending on private land. We'll have public land, the public's land, and we'll be the developer.
Given to the private.
And we will get we'll get the uplift. We'll get the profit, and we'll reinvest that in affordability on those sites. We'll be the developer. We'll do the master planning and all of that thing to get a great return for the taxpayer on public land, and everyone will have a chance and a right to buy houses on that land.
Thank you, Minister. Members, can I thank you very much for your contributions this afternoon, and can I thank the Minister? Sorry, Eoin, go on.
First of all, thank you for the way you've chaired the meeting today, but also giving up your own time to allow us to ask additional questions. I just want to put it on the record that I appreciate that.
So thanks for the white smoke. It was really nice to have an amicable meeting here today. But can I just thank the Minister, Mary, John and Dave, who all of them are regular visitors to our committee, and for their ongoing engagement and for the amount of information we were given a number of days prior to this committee, as always. So can I thank you very much for that. This meeting is now adjourned. Next meeting will be the 3rd of October, 9:30, and it's a housing bill, private members bill. Thank you.